Moonlight reflects off the barrel of a Winchester rifle as 6 masked rustlers lead a magnificent black stallion away from the Oakwood Ranch. The horse fights against its captors, nearly breaking free until one of the men strikes it with his riding crop. From the shadows of the farmhouse, a withered hand clenched into a fist as Thomas Caldwell watches in silence. Blue eyes hardening into steel as the men who've just taken everything that matters to him disappear into the night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What these rustlers don't realize is that the quiet farmer whose prize stallion they've stolen isn't just any man. Before he sought peace among his crops and horses, Thomas Caldwell was known by another name, one that made outlaws tremble from the Rio Grande to the Red River. After 15 years of living as a simple farmer, the most feared Texas Ranger in the state's history is about to dust off his badge and remind the frontier why criminals once spoke his name in whispers. The mid-morning sun beat down on Thomas Caldwell's weathered face as he worked the eastern fence line of Oakwood Ranch. At 52, his once jet-black hair had given way to silver at the temples, but his 6-foot frame remained as solid as oak, hardened by years of honest work. 15 seasons of planting and harvest had etched new lines into his face, different from the ones carved by his previous life. These were earned in peace, not violence. Thunder, his midnight black stallion, grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to watch his master work. The horse was more than just livestock. He was the last living connection to Thomas's past life. Bred from the finest bloodlines in Kentucky, Thunder had carried him through his final 3 years with the Rangers before following him into retirement. "Almost done, old friend," Thomas called, hammering the last fence post into place. "Then we'll ride into town for supplies." In the distance, Oakwood's modest farmhouse stood as testament to Thomas's second chance at life. He'd built it with his own hands after purchasing the 100-acre parcel just outside the growing town of Redemption, Texas. Few in town knew anything about his past. To them, he was just a private man who grew the finest corn in the county and raised horses good enough to catch premium prices at the Fort Worth auctions. Thomas loaded his tools into a weathered saddlebag and mounted Thunder with the practiced ease of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than out of it. As they crested the hill overlooking his property, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 15 years ago, he could never have imagined this life. Peaceful, quiet, his only battles against weather and weeds instead of the outlaws that had once been his daily concern. Redemption had grown considerably since Thomas first settled. Nearby, what had once been little more than a trading post now boasted a proper main street with a general store, 2 saloons, a small bank, and even a schoolhouse built just last year. Thomas tied Thunder outside Harlan's general store, patting the stallion's neck before heading inside. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," Sarah Harlan greeted from behind the counter. At 26, she'd taken over most of her aging father's duties at the store. Her smile brightened when she saw Thomas. "The usual supplies today?" "Yes, Ma'am," Thomas replied with a polite nod. "And perhaps some of that peppermint candy, if you've got it in stock." "Just got a fresh shipment yesterday," she said, gathering his supplies. "Beautiful day for riding. That horse of yours draws attention every time you bring him to town." Thomas smiled faintly. "Thunder's a fine animal. Been with me a long time." "Now, 15 years, if I recall correctly," came a deep voice from the back of the store. Sheriff William Porter stepped forward, his badge catching the light from the windows. "Same as you've been in these parts." Thomas stiffened almost imperceptibly. He and Porter had maintained a careful distance over the years. The sheriff was too young to have known Thomas during his ranger days, but he was smart enough to suspect there was more to the quiet farmer than met the eye. "Sheriff," Thomas acknowledged with a nod. "Keeping the peace?" "Trying to," Porter sighed, removing his hat. Getting harder these days. Had 3 farms hit by rustlers in the last month. The Donovan place got the worst of it. Lost 12 head of cattle and 2 horses. Sarah clasped her hand to her mouth. That's terrible. The Donovans have those. 4 little ones to feed. That's not the worst of it, Porter continued, his eyes fixed on Thomas. Rumor has it the Carson gang has moved into the territory. Mean bunch, led by Silas Carson, used to ride with the Coulter brothers before going his own way. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his mind was calculating. The Coulter brothers had been among the last outlaws he'd brought to justice before hanging up his badge. If their former associate was operating nearby, it wasn't a coincidence. Heard of them, Thomas said simply, paying Sarah for his supplies. Hope you catch them before anyone gets hurt. Could use a man who knows his way around trouble, Porter said casually. Deputy position still open. Thomas gathered his packages. I'm just a farmer, Sheriff. Those days are behind me. Porter's eyes narrowed slightly. What days would those be, Mr. Caldwell? A tense silence filled the store before Thomas tipped his hat to Sarah. Good day to you both. Outside, Thomas secured his supplies and mounted Thunder, his mind troubled as they headed home. The Carson gang's presence couldn't be a coincidence. Too many of the old outlaws had long memories and longer grudges. He'd hoped his past would stay buried, but experience had taught him that some things never truly remained in the ground. As Oakwood Ranch came into view, Thomas noticed a rider approaching from the north, Ethan Miller, his nearest neighbor. At 3 miles distant, the young man was pushing his horse hard, urgency in every line of his body. "Thomas!" Ethan called out, reining in his lathered horse. "Thank God I found you." "There's trouble. Masked men asking questions at farms all across the county. They came to my place this morning, asking if I knew anything about a former ranger living nearby." A cold weight settled in Thomas's stomach. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing," Ethan insisted. "But Thomas, they described your stallion perfectly, right down to the white diamond on his forehead. Said they were looking to buy, but their eyes told a different story." Thomas's jaw tightened as he looked toward his homestead. The peaceful life he'd built was balanced on the edge of a knife. "Get back to your family, Ethan. Lock your doors tonight." "You think they're coming for Thunder?" Ethan asked, concerned. About etching his young face. "I think they're coming for more than just my horse," Thomas replied grimly. As Ethan rode away, Thomas spurred Thunder toward the barn. Inside, he moved aside a loose floorboard beneath an empty stall, revealing a dusty wooden chest he hadn't opened in 15 years. The brass lock clicked open at his touch, revealing the contents he'd hoped never to need again: a pair of engraved Colt revolvers, a brass star-shaped badge, and a leather-bound journal filled with the names of men he'd hunted, captured, or buried. His fingers hovered over the items, each one a reminder of the life he'd left behind. The life of Marshal Thomas "Reckoning" Caldwell, the legendary ranger whose name once struck fear into the hearts of the most hardened criminals. "In Texas?" "Not yet," he murmured, closing the chest without removing its contents. "But soon, perhaps." Thomas didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on his porch in darkness, watching the road, Thunder safely secured in the barn. If trouble was coming, he'd face it head-on, but he'd do it as a farmer protecting his property, not as the ranger he once was. That resolution would be tested sooner than he expected. 3 nights later, Thomas sat at his kitchen table cleaning his shotgun by lamplight. The weapon was simple and honest, a farmer's tool, not a lawman's. Outside, an unseasonable storm rolled across the Texas plains, thunder echoing like distant artillery. Lightning illuminated the farmyard in harsh flashes, the rain coming down in sheets that drummed against the roof. Thunder hated storms. The stallion had always been skittish during lightning, a quirk that had nearly gotten them both killed during a pursuit near the Mexican border years ago. Thomas had spent many nights like this one, sitting up with the horse in the barn until the weather passed. He had just risen to check on Thunder when he caught movement through the rain-streaked window, a shadow where no shadow should be. Thomas extinguished his lamp and moved to the door, shotgun in hand. Years of honed instinct hadn't dulled with time. Something was wrong. The barn door was slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. Thomas was certain he'd latched it securely before sunset. Moving silent as death despite the mud underfoot, he approached from the side, using the storm's fury as cover for his approach. Voices drifted from inside, barely audible above the rain. Worth every penny. Pure Kentucky bloodline. Carson says a horse like this will fetch 2,000 in New Orleans. Quit your jawing and get the bridle on him. This storm ain't letting up. Thomas counted at least 3 distinct voices. His jaw clenched as he considered his options. The farmer he'd become suggested caution. No horse was worth dying for. But the ranger still burning inside him knew this was more than a simple theft. Before he could decide, Thunder's distressed whinny cut through the night, followed by the dull thud of a fist striking flesh. "Settle down, you worthless nag." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something ancient and dangerous awakened in Thomas's blood. He'd always had one rule, even in his most violent days with the Rangers: never harm an innocent. In his mind, that extended to animals, especially ones as noble as Thunder. Thomas moved to the barn's side door, easing it open with practiced stealth. Inside, lantern light cast long shadows as 3 men struggled with Thunder. The stallion reared and fought, eyes wild with fear as one rustler wrestled with his bridle while another attempted to saddle him. A 3rd man stood watch at the mane, doors, rifle in hand. "He won't settle," complained the man with the saddle. "Never seen a horse fight like this." "That's because he ain't just any horse," said a 4th voice, deeper than the others. A tall figure stepped from the shadows, his face obscured by a bandana. Unlike the others, he moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. Here's a ranger horse, trained for battle." The watcher by the door shifted nervously. "You didn't say anything about stealing from no ranger, Vance." "Ex-ranger," the leader corrected. 15 years retired and gone soft. "Just a dirt farmer now." Thomas had heard enough. He stepped into the lantern light, shotgun leveled. "I wouldn't be too sure about that." The 4 men froze. Thomas kept his voice steady, his aim unwavering. "Step away from my horse!" the leader. Vance recovered first, a slow smile spreading beneath his bandana. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume. Or should I say Marshal Caldwell?" "The name's Thomas to my neighbors, and that's all you need to know," Thomas replied. "Now you boys have 10 seconds to clear out of my barn before I put the first of you down." The rustler nearest Thunder made a fatal error. His hand dropped to his pistol. Thomas's shotgun roared, the blast catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him into the wall. Before the echo faded, Thomas had leveled his weapon at the next closest rustler. "That's one," he said calmly. "Who's next?" "Hold steady, boys," Vance ordered, raising his hands slightly. "No need for more bloodshed. We're just doing a job." "Jobs don't usually involve stealing a man's property," Thomas countered. "Who sent you?" Vance's eyes crinkled above his bandana. He was smiling. "You've been away from the game too long, Marshal. The rules have changed. The whole territory's changing." Lightning flashed, momentarily overpowering the lantern light. In that instant, Thomas spotted a 5th man he'd missed, positioned in the barn's loft. Before Thomas could react, something heavy struck him from behind. A 6th attacker who'd circled around outside. Thomas stumbled forward, stars exploding in his vision. He managed to swing the shotgun around, firing blindly. Someone yelped in pain, but then a boot connected with his ribs, driving him to the ground. The shotgun was wrenched from his grasp. Through blurred vision, Thomas saw Vance standing over him, Carson sends his regards, the rustler said, delivering a vicious kick to Thomas's temple. Darkness claimed him. Dawn broke with painful brightness against Thomas's eyelids. He lay face down in the mud outside his barn, rain still falling lightly. Every breath sent daggers of pain through his ribs. With tremendous effort, he pushed himself up, memories flooding back as consciousness fully returned. "Thunder," he gasped. Staggering to his feet, the barn stood open and empty. Thomas's prize stallion was gone, along with his saddle and bridle. Blood stained the straw where he'd shot the first rustler, but the man himself was gone. They'd taken their wounded with them. Thomas stumbled to the water trough, splashing his face to clear his mind. The name echoed in his thoughts. Carson. Silas Carson. The connection to his past was undeniable now. Moving gingerly, Thomas made his way back to the house. He'd taken a beating, but nothing seemed broken. These rustlers had been under orders to rough him up, not kill him. A message, then, not merely a theft. Inside, Thomas found his medical supplies and tended his wounds as best he could. A cut above his eye needed stitching, but it would have to wait. He had more pressing concerns. The hidden chest beneath the barn floor called to him now, its contents no longer just relics of a forsaken past. But first, Thomas needed information. Ignoring his body's protests, he saddled his old mare, Jenny. She wasn't Thunder, but she was steady and reliable. Within the hour, Thomas was riding toward town, determination hardening his features into a mask that would have been familiar to anyone who'd known him in his ranger days. Redemption was already buzzing with activity despite the early hour. Thomas tied Jenny outside the sheriff's office and pushed through the door without knocking. Sheriff Porter looked up from his desk, surprised at Thomas's battered appearance. "Jesus, Caldwell, what happened to you?" "Rustlers," Thomas said simply. 6 of them hit my place last night, took Thunder." Porter stood, concerned, genuine in his eyes. "Sit down before you fall down. Martha," he called to his wife in the back room, "bring some coffee and my medical kit." Thomas remained standing. "They mentioned Silas Carson." The sheriff's expression shifted. "Carson, huh? That complicates things. You know of him?" Porter's wife appeared with coffee and supplies, her eyes widening at Thomas's condition. As she cleaned his cut, Porter leaned against his desk. "Know of him? Half the territory knows of him by now. Carson's been building what amounts to an empire north of here. Started with rustling, moved into protection rackets. Now he's buying up land or running off anyone who won't sell." "And the law?" Thomas pressed. Porter's laugh was bitter. "Which law? County sheriff's in his pocket. U.S. Marshal for this district disappeared 3 months back. Armies stretched. Thin with Indian troubles up north." He studied Thomas carefully. "Are you sure it was Carson's men?" "One called their leader Vance. Said they were doing a job for Carson." Porter nodded grimly. "Vance Holloway, Carson's right hand, mean as a rattlesnake with twice the poison." He hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Carson's been asking about you specifically for weeks now, about your history." Thomas's face revealed nothing, but his mind was racing. "Has he now?" "Word is," Porter continued carefully, "Carson lost 2 brothers to the Rangers, about 16 years back, during that business with the Coulter gang." The pieces clicked into place. Thomas remembered the Carson brothers, Jacob and Ezekiel. They'd been riding with the Coulters during a bank robbery in El Paso. Thomas had led the ranger company that tracked them down. Both brothers had chosen bullets over surrender. "I need to borrow a horse," Thomas said, rising. "Something fast. I'll bring it back with Thunder." Porter studied him, decisions visible in his eyes. From his desk drawer, he withdrew a folded paper and slid it across to Thomas. It was a deputy's commission, already filled out with Thomas's name. "Take this." "2," Porter said quietly. "Make it official." Thomas stared at the commission, 15 years of peaceful existence hanging in the balance. Accepting that badge meant returning to the life he'd left behind, becoming again the man he'd tried to bury. "Why?" he asked. "Because Carson won't stop." "With your horse," Porter replied honestly. "And because redemption needs more than just me standing between it and men like Carson." He paused. "And because I know exactly who you used to be, Marshal Caldwell. Seasons back, before Carson took it over, he saw things, illegal things. When he threatened to go to the authorities, they broke both his legs and left him for dead in the Badlands." She straightened her shoulders. "He survived, but he'll never." "Walk right again. He's up in Denver now." "I'm sorry about your brother," Thomas said genuinely, "but that's all the more reason for you to stay clear of this business." "I didn't come to try and stop you," Sarah replied, reaching into her saddlebag. She withdrew a folded paper and handed it to him. "My father was a surveyor before opening the store. This is a detailed map of Three Forks Canyon, including the old mining trails most folks have forgotten about. There's a back way that Carson's men might not know." Thomas unfolded the map, immediately recognizing its value. "Why give me this?" Becker Thomas folded the deputy's commission and tucked it into his vest pocket without signing it. "I'll think on it," he told Porter, though they both knew he'd already made his decision the moment Thunder was taken. "Carson's main operation is based at the old Westbrook Ranch," Porter offered. "About 30 miles north of here, but you won't find your horse there." "Where then?" "Word is they moved their stolen stock to Three Forks Canyon before distributing them to buyers. It's defensible." "Remote," Thomas nodded. He knew the area well. In his ranger days, it had been a favored hideout for smugglers running guns into Mexico. "I'll need supplies." "Take what you need," Porter said, gesturing to the gun cabinet behind his desk. Town council approved a budget increase after Donovan Place was hit. Thomas selected a Winchester rifle and a box of ammunition. "I'll return what I don't use." As he turned to leave, Porter called after him, "Caldwell, Carson has at least 20 men riding with him now. Even the ranger you used to be would think twice about those odds." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Then it's a good thing. I'm just a farmer borrowing your horse." The ride back to Oakwood was slower than Thomas would have liked, his injuries protesting every hoofbeat. His mind, however, was clear and focused in a way it hadn't been for 15 years. Names, faces, and tactics long dormant resurfaced with surprising clarity. Reaching his farm, Thomas went straight to the hidden chest beneath the barn floor. This time, he lifted the contents reverently. Twin Colt peacemakers with custom grips made from mesquite wood, a well-oiled gun belt that still bore the patina of countless miles on horseback, and the brass star that had once defined his existence. Beneath, these lay items few had ever seen: a leather-bound journal containing details of every outlaw he'd pursued, and a folded map of the territory marked with hideouts, water sources, and terrain notations made during his years of tracking. Thomas carried everything to the house and spread it across his kitchen table. From a cabinet above his stove, he retrieved a small wooden box containing gun oil and cleaning tools. With practiced hands that remembered every motion, he disassembled and cleaned both Colts, checking the firing pins and cylinders with meticulous care. As he worked, Thomas allowed his mind to travel back to the last time he'd worn the star, the day he'd turned in his badge after bringing in the last of the Coulter gang. He'd been bone-weary, not just in body but in spirit. 15 years of violence had hollowed something inside him that he desperately needed to refill. Farming had done that. Growing things instead of hunting men had slowly rebuilt his faith in the world. Now, with every piece of his past he reclaimed, Thomas felt that peace slipping away, replaced by the cold efficiency that had once made him the territory's most feared lawman. By midday, his preparations were complete. The Colts hung at his hips, familiar weights that seemed to balance him rather than burden him. The rifle was secured to a borrowed saddle atop Porter's horse, a sturdy bay gelding with good lines. Thomas packed light, jerky, hardtack, coffee, and a canteen. If this took longer than his supplies lasted, he'd live off the land as he'd done countless times before. Before leaving, Thomas opened his journal to a fresh page and wrote a brief entry. March 18th, 1875. Thunder stolen by Carson's men. The past never truly leaves us. If I don't return, this record should go to Ranger headquarters in Austin. Carson's operation extends further than local rustling, suspect connections to territorial officials based on their scope and impunity. Thomas was securing the last of his gear when hoofbeats approached from the road. Instinctively, his hand dropped to his colt, but he relaxed when he recognized Sarah Harlan riding toward him. "Mr. Caldwell," she called, reining in her horse. Her eyes widened at the sight of his bandaged face, then traveled to the twin revolvers at his hips. "Sheriff Porter said you'd been attacked. I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine, Miss Harlan," Thomas replied, "just preparing to retrieve what's mine." Sarah dismounted, leading her horse closer. "By yourself, against Carson's gang." Her voice hardened with unexpected steel. "That's suicide, and you know it." Thomas studied her with new interest. "You seem to know something about Carson." Sarah's expression darkened. "My brother worked a cattle drive for the Westbrook Spread 2Us. Someone needs to stand up to Carson, and most folks around here are too scared." She met his eyes directly. "And because I've heard the whispers about who you used to be." Thomas carefully refolded the map. "Thank you." Sarah nodded. "There's something else you should know. One of Carson's men came into the store this morning, asking questions about you. Not just any man, Vance Holloway himself." "What kind of questions? About your habits, who your friends are?" She hesitated, "and specifically about whether you've maintained your shooting skills." Thomas processed this information. Carson wasn't just stealing a valuable horse. He was deliberately provoking the man Thomas used to be. "Miss Harlan, when you return to town, I'd appreciate it if you'd stay with friends for a few days. Somewhere. Not obvious." Concern flashed across her face. "You think they'd come after me just to talk to you?" "Men like Carson eliminate potential problems before they become actual problems," Thomas explained. "And they wouldn't hesitate to use innocent people as leverage." Sarah's expression hardened with resolve. "My cousin has a place outside town. I'll go there." She remounted her horse. "Mr. Caldwell, Thomas, be careful. Carson has eyes everywhere." After Sarah departed, Thomas studied her father's map. The canyon's back entrance would save him half a day's ride and potentially allow him to approach undetected. It was the kind of advantage he wouldn't have dared hope for. As the afternoon waned, Thomas made one final preparation. From beneath a floorboard in his bedroom, he withdrew a small tin containing personal items he'd kept separate from his ranger equipment. A faded photograph of a young woman, a dried wildflower pressed between tissue, and a simple gold band. Thomas slipped the ring onto the smallest finger of his left hand. It wouldn't fit any of the others anymore. Margaret had been gone 18 years now, taken by fever before he'd even joined the Rangers. In some ways, her death had created the lawman he became, channeling grief into relentless pursuit of justice. "One last ride," he whispered to her. "Memory." As twilight approached, Thomas mounted the bay gelding. He'd deliberately waited for evening, planning to cover as much ground as possible under darkness. Carson's men would be looking for pursuit, but they'd expect it to come hard and fast from town, not methodically from a lone rider approaching from an unexpected direction. Thomas rode north without looking back at the farm. If things went badly, he might never see it again. The thought didn't trouble him as much as it should have. In 15 years, he'd built a life there, but it had always felt temporary, like a way station rather than a destination. The real Thomas Caldwell, the one who'd slumbered beneath the farmer's calloused hands and sunburned neck, was fully awake now. Each mile that passed beneath the bay's steady hooves brought back more of the man known as Reckoning Caldwell, the ranger who had tracked the territory's most dangerous outlaws across impossible terrain, who could read sign others missed, and whose patience was as legendary as his marksmanship. By full dark, Thomas had covered 10 miles, keeping to less traveled paths and avoiding the main trails where Carson might have lookouts. He made a cold camp in a small arroyo, allowing the horse to rest while he studied Sarah's map by starlight. Three Forks Canyon was still a day's ride away. Thomas knew he was racing against time. Valuable horses like Thunder would be moved quickly to prevent recovery. But rushing would only alert Carson's network of informants. Patience had always been Thomas's greatest weapon, and he would need it now more than ever. As he settled against his saddle for a few hours' rest, Thomas's hand drifted to the unsigned deputy's commission in his vest pocket. Tomorrow, he'd have to decide whether to wear the star again or face Carson as a private citizen seeking justice. Either choice would change his life irrevocably. Under the vast Texas sky, Thomas Caldwell closed his eyes, but his senses remained, alert, tuned to the wilderness around him. The former ranger was hunting once more, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, Silas Carson's reckoning approached with every passing hour. Dawn found Thomas already on the move, riding steadily through mesquite-covered hills. He'd abandoned the main trails entirely, relying on old ranger routes that didn't appear on standard maps. Every few miles, he dismounted to check for tracks or signs of Carson's men. By mid-morning, he found what he was looking for, the distinctive hoofprint of Thunder's left front shoe, which had a small notch from a manufacturing defect. The tracks were part of a larger group, at least 8. Horses heading northeast. Thomas knelt, examining the soil disturbance. Less than a day old, confirming his suspicion that they were moving the stolen stock quickly. "All right, boy," he murmured to Thunder, though the stallion was miles ahead. "I'm coming." Around noon, Thomas crested a ridge overlooking Serpent Creek, a winding waterway that marked the unofficial boundary of Carson's claimed territory. According to Porter, everything north of the creek had fallen under the Outlaws' influence over the past year. Ranches bought or seized, local lawmen bribed or run off. Through his field glasses, Thomas spotted a small way station near the creek crossing. Once a humble trading post, it now flew Carson's flag, a stylized rattlesnake coiled beneath a bold letter C. 2 armed men lounged on the porch, rifles in easy reach. Thomas observed for nearly an hour, noting the arrival and departure of a rider carrying what appeared to be messages. The station was clearly serving as a checkpoint. Anyone crossing Serpent Creek would be seen and reported upstream. Consulting Sarah's map, Thomas traced an alternate route that would take him 2 miles downstream to a shallower crossing. It meant several extra hours of travel, but avoiding detection was worth the delay. By late afternoon, Thomas had successfully crossed Serpent Creek unobserved and was making his way through increasingly rugged terrain. The land rose steadily toward the distant silhouette of Broken Tooth Ridge, behind which lay Three Forks Canyon. As twilight approached, movement in a ravine below caught his attention. Thomas dismounted, securing the bay behind a cluster of boulders, and crept forward to investigate. In the gathering shadows, he made out 4 riders escorting a wagon. They weren't moving with the urgency of men on a mission, but rather the casual confidence of those on familiar ground. Carson's men, almost certainly. Thomas took up a position behind a rock outcropping, training his field glasses on the group. The wagon was loaded with supplies, food staples, ammunition boxes, and several barrels that likely contained whiskey. A regular resupply run for Carson's operation. A plan began forming in Thomas's mind. These men would know where Thunder was being kept, and they were heading in the right direction. Taking a prisoner wasn't part of his original strategy, but adaptability had always been one of his strengths. Thomas studied the terrain ahead, identifying a narrow pass where the ravine constricted between two rocky slopes. It was the perfect location for an ambush. Limited visibility, no easy escape routes, and natural high ground for a shooter. Moving quickly but carefully, Thomas circled wide to get ahead of the wagon. The bay gelding followed obediently, its hooves wrapped with cloth to muffle their sound on the rocky ground. They reached the pass with 20 minutes to spare. Thomas positioned himself on the southern slope where the setting sun would be at, his back putting glare in the eyes of anyone looking up. He secured the horse out of sight, checked his weapons, and settled in to wait. The old familiar calm descended over him, the ranger's patience that had broken countless outlaws who thought they could outlast him. Thomas became as still as the rocks around him, controlling his breathing, allowing his senses to expand and absorb every detail of his surroundings. The wagon's approach was heralded by the creak of wheels and the casual conversation of men who felt secure in their territory. Thomas waited until they were halfway through the pass before making his move. "That's far enough," he called, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority that had once made it famous throughout the territory. "Hands where I can see them." The reaction was immediate, confusion, followed by hands reaching for weapons. Thomas's first shot kicked up dirt directly in front of the lead rider's horse, causing it to rear in panic. "Next one won't miss," Thomas warned. "Weapons on the ground, nice and slow." The driver of the wagon, an older man with a grey-streaked beard, was the first to comply, carefully placing his shotgun on the seat beside him. "Easy now, mister. We're just making a delivery." For Silas Carson, Thomas stated rather than asked, "Which makes you either outlaws or accessories?" One of the riders, young, probably no more than 20, made a fatal mistake. Rather than surrendering, he yanked his revolver from its holster. Thomas's shot caught him in the shoulder before the gun cleared leather, spinning him from his saddle. The other riders froze, hands halfway raised. "Anyone else feeling brave?" Thomas asked, his voice cold. When no one moved, he continued, "Good. Now the rest of those weapons are on the ground." Once disarmed, Thomas ordered the 3 uninjured men to dismount and move to the side of the ravine. The wounded young rider sat clutching his shoulder, face pale with shock. "You," Thomas gestured to the wagon driver with his Colt, "bind his wound. Then you're going to answer some questions." "Who the hell are you?" demanded one of the riders, a stocky man with a scar running across his nose. "Someone who wants his horse back," Thomas replied simply. "Black stallion with a white diamond on his forehead, stolen 3 nights ago from Oakwood Ranch." Recognition dawned in the wagon driver's eyes as he finished bandaging the young man's shoulder. "You're Caldwell." Thomas nodded. "Where's my horse?" The driver hesitated, glancing at his companions. The scarred rider spat on the ground. "You're dead, mister. You just don't know it yet. Nobody steals from Carson and lives to brag about it." "Funny, I was thinking the same thing about my property," Thomas replied. He fired a shot that clipped the scarred man's ear, drawing a howl of pain. "Next one goes through your knee. Where's the stallion?" "3 forks holding pens," the driver blurted out, ignoring the scarred man's glare. "But you'll never get near him. Carson's got at least 15 men guarding those horses." "Names and positions," Thomas demanded. "I don't know the positions," the driver insisted. "I just make deliveries, but Vance Holloway runs the operation. When Carson isn't there, they're moving the prime stock tomorrow night, your stallion included. Buyers coming in from Louisiana." Thomas processed this information. Tomorrow night gave him less than 24 hours to locate Thunder and extract him from a heavily guarded compound. The odds weren't favorable, but he'd faced worse. "What else should I know about the canyon setup?" "Lookouts on both ridges," offered the driver, ignoring the threatening looks from his companions. "Watching the main approaches, Signal system with mirrors during day, lanterns at night. Changes every week, but it's 3 flashes right now for a friendly approach. The scarred man lunged suddenly at the driver. "Shut your mouth, Jenkins." Thomas's pistol cracked again, and the scarred man collapsed, clutching his thigh where a bullet had torn through muscle. "Appreciate the cooperation, Jenkins," Thomas said calmly. "Now, what about Carson himself?" Jenkins shook his head. "He comes and goes, but word is he's expecting something big soon, more than just horse trading. Been bringing in extra men, stockpiling ammunition." "For what?" "Don't know for certain. Talk among the men says he's planning to take over Redemption next. Consolidate his hold on the whole territory." A cold anger settled in Thomas's gut. This confirmed his suspicion that Thunder's theft wasn't random. It was the opening move in a larger strategy, deliberately provoking him to draw him out. "Here's what happens now," Thomas informed them. "I'm taking your weapons, your horses, and whatever ammunition is in that wagon. You can keep the food and whiskey." "You're letting us go?" Jenkins asked, surprised. "With a message for Carson," Thomas replied. "Tell him Thomas Caldwell is coming for what's his. And unlike 15 years ago, this time I'm not taking prisoners." The uninjured rider frowned. 15 years ago, Thomas withdrew the unsigned deputy's commission from his pocket, unfolded it, and signed his name with a pencil stub. Then he unpinned the brass star from inside his vest and affixed it to his chest, where it had ridden for 15 years before his retirement. "Tell Carson that Marshal Reckoning sends his regards." Jenkins's face was drained of color. "You're the Reckoning? The ranger who took down the Coulter gang?" "The same," Thomas confirmed, "and Carson should remember what happened to the last men who stole something of value from me." Thomas efficiently collected their weapons, ammunition, and horses, keeping 1 pack horse to carry the extra guns and sending the rest scattering with slaps to their flanks. He bound the wounded men loosely, tight enough to delay them, but not so tight as to cause further injury. "You've got about 4 hours of daylight left," he informed them. "Creek's 3 miles south. I suggest you start walking." As Thomas mounted the bay, Jenkins called after him, "Marshal, Carson's expecting you. Said you'd come if we took the horse. It's a trap." Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "I'm counting on it." Riding away with his newly acquired supplies, Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. His first encounter with Carson's men had yielded valuable intelligence and resources, but more importantly, it had confirmed his suspicion. This was personal. Silas Carson wasn't just a rustler expanding his territory. He was a man seeking revenge for his brother's deaths, using Thunder as bait to draw out the legendary ranger who had killed them. Now the trap was set, the pieces in motion. But Carson had made one critical miscalculation. He'd awakened the very man he sought to destroy. The peaceful farmer was gone, and in his place rode Marshal Thomas Reckoning Caldwell, who had never failed to bring in his quarry. As night fell over the territory, Thomas made camp in a hidden arroyo, planning his approach to Three Forks Canyon. Tomorrow would bring him face to face with Vance Holloway, Silas Carson's right hand, and one step closer to reclaiming what was his. Thomas rose well before dawn, the old habits of his ranger days returning as naturally as breathing. He broke camp methodically, leaving no trace of his presence, a skill that had once earned him the nickname Ghost among certain outlaw circles before the more ominous Reckoning took hold. While preparing a small pot of coffee over carefully shielded coals, Thomas inventoried his newly acquired arsenal. From the 4 Carson men, he'd collected 3 revolvers of varying quality, 2 Winchester rifles, a coach gun, and several boxes of ammunition. The firearms themselves were less valuable to him than the ammunition. He trusted only his own. Well-maintained weapons, but extra bullets always proved useful. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Thomas consulted Sarah Harlan's map one final time, committing the details to memory before folding it away. His objective lay 6 miles to the northwest, Three Forks Canyon, where Thunder was being held. According to Jenkins, Carson had positioned lookouts on the canyon ridges, watching all standard approaches. But Sarah's map revealed an alternative. An old mining trail that wound through a series of narrow defiles before emerging near the canyon's least accessible fork. It had been abandoned decades ago, when the silver veins played out, and might well have been forgotten by Carson's men. Thomas packed his gear and mounted the bay, leaving the pack horse secured in a hidden gully with enough water and feed for a day. If everything went according to plan, he'd retrieve it on his way back with Thunder. If not, well, the horse would eventually break free. The route to the abandoned mining trail tested both horse and rider. The trail had deteriorated over years of disuse, in some places nearly vanishing beneath rockfalls and encroaching vegetation. Twice, Thomas had to dismount and lead the bay through particularly treacherous sections, the drop-offs to either side steep enough to kill man and horse alike. By mid-morning, Thomas reached a vantage point that offered his first glimpse of Three Forks Canyon. As the name suggested, the canyon split into 3 separate branches, forming a rough trident shape. The central fork was widest, with sloping walls that permitted easier access. The eastern and western forks were narrower, their walls steeper and more defensible. Through his field glasses, Thomas observed significant activity in the central fork. A makeshift corral held at least 30 horses, with several small structures nearby that appeared to be bunkhouses. Men moved about with the easy confidence of those on home ground, most armed with rifles or sidearms. Thomas scanned the herd methodically, searching for Thunder's distinctive black coat and white diamond marking. The stallion wasn't immediately visible, but given the information from Jenkins, that wasn't surprising. A horse as valuable as Thunder would likely be kept separate from the general herd, perhaps in one of the structures or a special enclosure. Continuing his surveillance, Thomas noted the positions of sentries, 2 men on the eastern ridge, another pair on the western, all with clear sight lines to the canyon approaches. They maintained a pattern of movement, changing positions every 20 minutes or so to avoid fatigue and maintain alertness. Professional, not just common rustlers. After nearly an hour of observation, Thomas spotted his target. Vance Holloway emerged from the largest structure, a log cabin set against the canyon's central wall. Even from a distance, Holloway's bearing marked him as a man accustomed to command. The other men deferred to him as he inspected the horse herd and issued orders. As Holloway moved toward a smaller structure separated from the main camp, Thomas shifted his field glasses to follow. The building appeared to be a secure, stable, with a heavy door and single window. Holloway unlocked the door and entered, emerging moments later leading a magnificent black stallion. Thunder, Thomas whispered, a mixture of relief and anger flooding him as he observed his horse's condition. The stallion appeared uninjured but agitated, fighting against Holloway's control. As Thomas watched, Holloway struck Thunder with a breeding crop, eliciting a surge of cold rage in the former ranger. Holloway led the stallion to a separate pen, where a grey-haired man in an expensive coat examined the horse with the critical eye of a professional buyer. The 2 men conversed, gesturing toward Thunder's lines and conformation, clearly discussing his value. After several minutes, they returned Thunder to the secure stable. Thomas lowered his field glasses, mind racing as he formulated a plan. A direct assault was out of the question. At least 20 armed men against 1, regardless of his skills, were odds no sane man would challenge. But tonight, when darkness provided cover, he might be able to reach the secure stable undetected via the mining trail, retrieve Thunder, and escape before the alarm was raised. A flicker of movement caught Thomas's attention. A rider approaching the canyon from the north, moving at speed. Through his glasses, Thomas observed the sentry's reaction. 3 flashes of a mirror, the recognition signal Jenkins had mentioned. The response came promptly from the rider, confirming his identity as one of Carson's men. Thomas tracked the newcomer as he entered the canyon and rode directly to Holloway. The two conferred briefly before Holloway barked orders that sent men scrambling throughout the camp. Within minutes, the activity level doubled. Men checking weapons, saddling, horses moving with newfound urgency. Something had changed. The buyer was escorted to his horse and departed quickly, suggesting the sales were being accelerated or postponed. Thomas needed to know why. Retreating from his observation point, Thomas followed a game trail that paralleled the canyon rim for a half-mile before descending to the canyon floor through a series of switchbacks. This approach kept him well away from the sentry's lines of sight, though it placed him dangerously close to the outlaw camp itself. Leaving the bay secured in a dense thicket, Thomas proceeded on foot, using every scrap of cover the terrain provided. 15 years of farming hadn't dulled his ability to move silently through difficult ground, reading the land and flowing with it rather than against it. As he drew closer to the camp, voices carried on the afternoon breeze confirmed it was Caldwell himself, took down Jenkins's whole supply team without breaking a sweat. The speaker was the newly arrived rider, still dusty from the trail. Holloway's response was measured but tense. "How many casualties?" "2. Wounded, none dead. Send them back with a message." A pause. "Jenkins says it's him, Vance. The Reckoning. Said he was wearing the star and everything." A murmur ran through the gathered men. Thomas wasn't the only one aware of his former reputation. Holloway silenced them with a gesture. "Carson's already on his way. Should be here by sundown. Until then, double the guards on all approaches. Anyone spots Caldwell, don't engage alone. Fire 3 shots as warning." "What about the horses?" someone asked. "Buyer's coming back tomorrow with his men." "We move ahead as planned," Holloway replied, "but the Black Stallion stays separate. Carson wants him intact for when Caldwell arrives." "You really think one old ranger's going to walk into our camp with more than 20 guns waiting for him?" The skepticism in the man's voice was clear. Holloway's response chilled Thomas despite the afternoon heat. "Carson's been planning this for 15 years. He knows exactly what Caldwell will do." He turned to address the assembled men. "Remember, Carson wants him alive. The man who captures Reckoning Caldwell gets 500 in gold, over and above your regular pay." As the men dispersed to their assignments, Thomas retreated, processing this new information. The situation had just become significantly more complicated. Silas Carson himself was arriving by sundown, bringing who knew how many additional men. The window for rescuing Thunder before Carson's arrival was closing rapidly. Furthermore, it was now clear that Thunder's theft had been merely the opening move in Carson's elaborate revenge scheme. The ultimate goal wasn't the stallion's value, but Thomas himself, captured alive for whatever grim purpose Carson had. Spent 15 years contemplating. Returning to the bay, Thomas considered his options. The original plan, a nighttime infiltration to retrieve Thunder, was now considerably riskier with heightened security and more men. Yet waiting was equally dangerous, as Carson's arrival would only strengthen the opposing force. As Thomas contemplated his next move, a glint of sunlight on metal caught his eye, approaching riders from the south, at least 6 of them moving fast. Through his field glasses, he identified the lead rider immediately, Sheriff Porter, astride his distinctive Appaloosa, accompanied by what appeared to be a hastily assembled posse. Thomas suppressed a curse. Porter's intentions might be honorable, but he was riding straight into Carson's territory with insufficient men and no understanding of the situation's complexity. At their current pace, they would reach the canyon's main entrance within the hour, where Carson's sentries would easily spot them. Moving quickly, Thomas mounted the bay and set off on an intercept course, pushing the horse as fast as the rough terrain allowed. If he could reach Porter's group before they blundered into Carson's detection net, he might prevent a massacre. The bay responded admirably, seemingly sensing the urgency of their mission. Thomas guided the horse through a series of ravines and dry washes that ran parallel to Porter's likely route, hoping to cut them off before they crossed Serpent Creek. 20 minutes of hard riding brought Thomas to a ridgeline overlooking the creek. Porter's group was just visible in the distance, perhaps a quarter-mile from the crossing. Thomas positioned himself on the ridge and fired 3 shots in quick succession. Not Carson's alarm signal, but an old ranger pattern that any lawman would recognize as a call for caution. The posse reined in immediately, heads turning to locate the source of the shots. Thomas stood in his stirrups, making himself visible, and waved his hat in a deliberate pattern. Porter detached from the group and rode cautiously toward the ridge, while his men maintained their position. Thomas guided the bay down the ridge to meet the sheriff, keeping to cover as much as possible to avoid being spotted by any of Carson's patrols. Caldwell, Porter greeted him as they met in a small copse of cottonwoods, was hoping I'd find you before you got yourself killed. Got word about your run-in with Jenkins and his boys. You shouldn't have come, Thomas replied. Carson's got at least 20 men at Three Forks, with more arriving by sundown. Your 6 wouldn't make it past the canyon entrance. Porter's expression hardened. Wasn't planning on a frontal assault. Came to warn you, Carson's been spreading word that you murdered those supply men in cold blood, using your authority as a deputy to commit frontier justice. He's filed formal complaints with the territorial governor. Political cover, Thomas observed. Makes it easier to kill or capture me if I'm wanted for murder. It's worse than that, Porter continued grimly. Sarah Harlan intercepted a telegram at her father's store. Carson's got connections in Austin, high ones. If he takes you down, it'll be ruled legitimate, regardless of circumstances. Thomas absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture of Carson's operation. This goes beyond revenge for his brothers, then. Way beyond, Porter confirmed. Carson's building a power base. Word from Austin is that he's angling for appointment as the new U.S. Marshal for the territory once the current one's unfortunate disappearance is officially recognized. The pieces fell into place for Thomas. Carson's methodical takeover of the region wasn't just criminal enterprise. It was political calculation. Taking down Reckoning. Caldwell would cement his reputation as a law and order candidate while eliminating one of the few men who knew the truth about his operation. You need to pull back, Thomas told Porter. Get your men to safety and telegraph Austin. Make the connection between Carson and the missing Marshal public before he can control the narrative. Porter nodded reluctantly. And what about you? Thomas's eyes turned toward the distant outline of Three Forks Canyon, where his horse and his enemy waited. Silas Carson wants to face the reckoning, he said quietly. I aim to accommodate him. After ensuring Porter and his posse retreated safely beyond Carson's territory, Thomas returned to his vantage point overlooking Three Forks Canyon. The afternoon was wearing on, with perhaps 3 hours of daylight remaining before Carson's expected arrival at sundown. Thomas's original plan, a stealthy nighttime rescue, was no longer viable. With security heightened and Carson himself arriving soon, the odds were shifting further against him with each passing hour. Yet rushing in without a strategy would be suicide. Think, Caldwell, he murmured to himself, scanning the canyon layout once more through his field glasses. The problem wasn't just the number of men. During his ranger days, he'd faced similar odds. The real challenge was extracting Thunder. Alive and unharmed, a frontal assault would put the stallion at risk, either as collateral damage or as a hostage. As Thomas studied the canyon, he noted a potential weakness in Carson's security. The Outlaws' men were professionals, but they were preparing for a specific threat, a lone former ranger approaching stealthily. Their attention was focused outward, watching the approaches to the canyon. What if the threat came from within? An audacious plan began forming in Thomas's mind. Jenkins had mentioned the signal system, 3 flashes for friendly approach. He'd also noted that buyers were expected tomorrow to purchase the stolen stock. Thomas returned to his packhorse and rummaged through the supplies taken from Jenkins's wagon. Among them, he found a bundle of papers, delivery manifests, crude maps, and a folded document that drew his immediate attention. A letter of introduction to Silas Carson, identifying the bearer as a representative of Beaumont Trading Company, out of Louisiana. The letter was made out to Samuel Jenkins, explaining why the man had been so willing to cooperate after capture. He wasn't just a supply runner. He was Carson's connection to the buyers. Thomas studied the document carefully. With some minor alterations, it could serve a new purpose. From his saddlebag, he retrieved a small writing kit, a holdover from his ranger days when field reports were often necessary. Working methodically, Thomas modified the letter, changing dates and details to indicate he was an advance representative arriving ahead of the main buying party. It wouldn't withstand intense scrutiny, but it might get him through the front door. Next came the physical transformation. Thomas removed his distinctive ranger attire, replacing it with clothing taken from Jenkins's supplies, a plain cotton shirt, nondescript vest, and a wide-brimmed hat, different from his usual style. He smeared dust and trail grime strategically to suggest a long journey and affected a slight stoop to alter his silhouette. The final touch was psychological. Thomas had spent years cultivating the demeanor of a confident lawman who commanded respect with a glance. Now he practiced the opposite, the deferential manner of a man who worked for others, who avoided direct eye contact and kept his opinions to himself. "Just another business agent," Thomas murmured, testing the persona. He deliberately softened, his speech adding a hint of an Eastern accent. Nothing specific enough to challenge, but different from his usual frontier drawl. His Colts presented the greatest challenge. No business agent would carry such distinctive weapons, yet Thomas refused to be without them. Eventually he wrapped them in a saddle blanket and secured them beneath the bay's saddle, accessible if needed, but not immediately visible. As the sun began its western descent, Thomas made his final preparations. He retrieved the Winchester rifle from Jenkins's supplies, a serviceable weapon without the distinctive modifications of his own, and slung it from his saddle in plain view. A business agent traveling through dangerous territory would be expected to carry protection. With one last review of Sarah's map to confirm the main entrance to the canyon, Thomas mounted the bay and set off, deliberately taking the most visible approach trail. The success of his plan depended on being seen but not recognized by Carson's sentries. As he approached the canyon mouth, Thomas adopted his businessman persona completely, slouching slightly in the saddle, gaze darting nervously as though constantly assessing danger. When the expected signal came from the ridge, 3 flashes of reflected sunlight, he responded with the same pattern, using a small mirror from his kit. 2 riders emerged from concealed positions, rifles ready, but not directly aimed. Thomas raised his hand slightly, the universal gesture of peaceful intent. "That's far enough," called the lead rider, a hard-faced man with a prominent nose and a week's growth of beard. "State your business." Thomas reached slowly into his vest, retrieving the modified letter. "Samuel Whitfield, representing Beaumont Trading Company," he announced in his practiced Eastern accent. "I've been dispatched ahead of Mr. Beaumont's purchasing team to inspect the current stock and finalize arrangements." The guard eyed him suspiciously. "Wasn't expecting anyone until tomorrow." Thomas affected an expression of mild indignation. "Perhaps you weren't informed. Mr. Beaumont was quite clear that I should arrive today to complete preliminary inspections. The letter should explain everything. The guard took the document, scanning it with narrowed eyes. Thomas maintained his slightly nervous demeanor, inwardly calculating the odds of success. If these men had personally met Jenkins before, or if Carson had already arrived at the camp, his deception would fail instantly. After a long moment, the guard folded the letter and handed it back. "Holloway will want to see this. Follow us, but keep your hands where we can see them." Thomas nodded deferentially, allowing himself to be escorted between the two riders. As they entered the canyon proper, he absorbed every detail while appearing to notice nothing, counting men, noting weapon placements, identifying potential escape routes. The central area of the canyon buzzed with activity. Men were busy constructing additional holding pens, suggesting Carson expected to expand his operation significantly. The existing corral held at least 30 horses, many bearing brands that had been crudely altered. Thomas was led directly to the cabin he'd observed earlier. Vance Holloway emerged before they dismounted, his sharp eyes taking in the new arrival with immediate suspicion. "Who's this?" he demanded. "Says he's from Beaumont Trading," the guard explained, handing over Thomas's letter. "Advance man for tomorrow's buyers." Holloway studied the document, then looked up at Thomas with piercing intensity. "Beaumont usually sends Jenkins." Thomas had prepared for this. Mr. Jenkins was unavailable. "Took ill in Fort Worth," he explained smoothly. "Mr. Beaumont didn't want to delay the transaction, so I was dispatched in his place." Holloway's gaze remained skeptical. "Dismount, slowly." Thomas complied, maintaining his submissive posture while mentally noting the positions of every man within sight. 7 visible, likely more inside the buildings or posted as sentries. "You've come a long way for nothing, Mr. Whitfield," Holloway said, handing back the letter. "Purchase arrangements have changed. Your employer will need to contact Mr. Carson directly to reschedule." Thomas was disappointed. "That's most unfortunate. Mr. Beaumont was particularly interested in the black stallion I was told would be available. He authorized a substantial premium for that animal specifically." Holloway's expression shifted subtly, greed momentarily overcoming caution. "The stallion's not for sale at any price. He belongs to Mr. Carson personally." "I see," Thomas replied, allowing his gaze to wander toward the separate stable where he'd observed Thunder earlier. "Perhaps I could at least inspect the other stock. I've come a considerable distance, and Mr. Beaumont will expect a thorough report." After a moment's hesitation, Holloway nodded. "Phillips, escort Mr. Whitfield to the main corral. Let him look. At his fill, but he touches nothing, and he doesn't go near the private stable." The guard who had first intercepted Thomas gestured for him to follow. As they walked toward the horse pens, Thomas maintained his businessman facade while his mind worked furiously. He'd successfully infiltrated the camp, but extracting Thunder would require both perfect timing and significant distraction. Through gaps between buildings, Thomas spotted the secure stable where Thunder was kept. 2 armed men stood guard outside. Its single door, excessive security for a mare horse, confirming the stallion's status as bait in Carson's trap. "Quite an operation you have here," Thomas remarked casually to his escort as they reached the main corral. "How many men does Mr. Carson employ now?" Phillips snorted. "More every week. Got nearly 30 riding for him now, with 10 more expected tonight." "Tonight?" Thomas raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Big plans," Phillips replied with pride. "Once Carson gets appointed marshal, we'll be running this whole territory legal-like." Thomas turned away to hide his expression, pretending to examine a sorrel mare in the corral. The piece Porter had shared was evidently common knowledge among Carson's men. They anticipated their leader receiving official authority, transforming their criminal enterprise into a sanctioned operation. As Thomas conducted his pretend inspection, he overheard fragments of conversation from nearby men. Carson's bringing special shackles for the reckoning. Says he wants him alive for the hanging. Frontier justice. Public example. The Tsar. Picture grew clearer with each passing moment. Carson wasn't just planning revenge. He was orchestrating a public spectacle. The formal execution of the legendary ranger who had killed his brothers, conducted under color of law once he secured his appointment as marshal. Thomas needed to accelerate his timeline. Somewhere, in the canyon, hidden from immediate view, was the key to both Thunder's rescue and his own survival. The confirmation that Carson was responsible for the disappearance of the current U.S. Marshal. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Forks Canyon, Thomas Caldwell, hidden behind his Samuel Whitfield persona, continued his charade of inspecting horses while planning not just an escape, but the downfall of an empire built on corruption and murder. "Seen enough?" Phillips asked gruffly, after Thomas had spent nearly 30 minutes examining the stolen horses in the main corral. "Almost," Thomas replied, maintaining his Eastern businessman persona. "Mr. Beaumont is quite particular about bloodlines. These Palominos, for instance. Wyoming stock, if I'm not mistaken." Phillips shrugged. "Don't ask me. I just guard 'em." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his peripheral vision tracking the movements of Carson's men around the camp. The sun hung low in the western sky now. If Carson was indeed arriving at sundown, as Holloway had indicated, time was running perilously short. "I'd like to examine your operations records if possible," Thomas suggested. "Breeding histories, acquisition documents. Mr. Beaumont requires thorough documentation for substantial purchases." Phillips scoffed. "We don't keep papers on the stock." "No. How unfortunate." Thomas was disappointed. Legitimate businesses typically maintain extensive records. Mr. Beaumont will be concerned about potential complications with ownership. The guard's expression darkened. "Are you questioning our business practices?" Thomas backpedaled smoothly. "Not at all. Simply explaining my employer's requirements. Perhaps Mr. Holloway maintains the records himself. A man in his position surely understands the importance of documentation." Phillips hesitated, then gestured toward the main cabin. "Office is in there, but Holloway doesn't like strangers poking around his papers." "I completely understand," Thomas assured him. "I'll be brief and discreet." As they approached the cabin, Thomas spotted Holloway across the camp, engaged in heated conversation with several men near the smithy. Perfect timing. If he could gain access to the office without Holloway's direct supervision, he might find the evidence he needed. Phillips knocked on the cabin door. A young man with a ledger book answered. "Whitfield here needs to see some paperwork," Phillips explained. "Beaumont's man wants breeding records or some such." The clerk looked confused. "We don't keep—" "I understand discretion is paramount. In your line of work," Thomas interrupted smoothly, "but surely Mr. Holloway maintains transaction records, financial documents. My employer simply needs verification of the stock's origins for his records." The clerk glanced nervously toward where Holloway stood across the camp, then back at Thomas. "Mr. Holloway keeps his own records locked in his desk. I just manage the men's pay ledgers." Thomas nodded understandingly. "Perhaps I could review those while awaiting Mr. Holloway's return. They might contain the information Mr. Beaumont requires." After a moment's hesitation, the clerk stepped aside. "Don't touch nothing except the payroll book on the table." Thomas entered, Phillips following close behind. The cabin's interior was divided into two spaces, a front office with a desk, and file cabinet, and a back room behind a closed door, presumably Holloway's private quarters. The clerk pointed to a leather-bound ledger on the desk. "Payroll's all in there. Mr. Holloway handles all other business himself." Thomas began examining the ledger, appearing absorbed in its contents while surreptitiously scanning the room. A small iron safe stood in the corner beside Holloway's desk. The back room door featured a substantial lock. Unusual security for a simple outlaw camp. After several minutes of pretending to study the payroll records, Thomas closed the book. Most informative, though not quite what Mr. Beaumont requires. Is there a washroom I might use before continuing my inspection of the stock? The clerk pointed toward a door on the side of the cabin. Outhouse is out back. Thank you, Thomas said, rising. To Phillips he added, I won't be long. The guard nodded grudgingly. Don't wander. Thomas exited through the indicated door, which opened onto a narrow passage leading behind the cabin. Once out of sight, he moved quickly along the building's rear wall, looking for windows to Holloway's private quarters. He found one, partially concealed by a scraggly juniper bush. The window was small but unlatched, an oversight likely due to the camp's remote location and abundant security. Thomas glanced around to ensure he wasn't observed, then eased the window open and slipped inside with the fluid grace that had once made him the Rangers' most effective infiltrator. Holloway's private quarters were spartanly furnished, a bed, a washstand, and a writing desk beneath a coal oil lamp. Unlike the outer office, this room contained numerous personal items, including a locked chest at the foot of the bed and several maps pinned to the walls. Thomas worked methodically, beginning with the desk. The drawers were locked, but the mechanisms were simple. Using a thin knife blade from his boot, Thomas had them open within seconds. The contents were revealing. Financial ledgers far more detailed than the payroll book in the front office. Correspondence with various territorial officials, and most significantly, a small leather folio containing what appeared to be blackmail material, compromising information on judges, bankers, and politicians throughout the territory. Thomas scanned these documents quickly, memorizing key names and details. The extent of Carson's corruption network was staggering. He had leveraged information and intimidation to position sympathetic officials throughout the territorial government. Deeper in the desk, Thomas found what he was seeking: correspondence regarding Marshal James Hargrove, the missing U.S. Marshal. The letters, exchanged between Carson and someone identified only as W.M., in Austin, detailed arrangements for Hargrove's removal and Carson's subsequent appointment to the vacant position. The final letter in the sequence confirmed Thomas's worst suspicions: Hargrove problem permanently resolved. Body disposed of in abandoned silver mine 2 miles NW of Three Forks. Appointment should proceed as planned once the reckoning situation concluded. VH written in Holloway's own hand, the note was damning evidence of premeditated murder of a federal official. Thomas pocketed this letter. It alone would be enough to destroy Carson's ambitions and potentially send both him and Holloway to the gallows. Before closing the desk, Thomas noticed one more item of interest: a small key, different from those that had locked the drawers. On a hunch, he tried it on the chest at the foot of the bed. The lock turned smoothly, revealing contents that sent a chill through Thomas's veins. Inside lay Marshal Hargrove's badge, personal effects, and official documentation kept as trophies or insurance, perhaps both. Beneath these items was a folded set of papers bearing the territorial governor's seal, Carson's provisional appointment as U.S. Marshal, awaiting only final signatures. Thomas secured the badge and documents, then carefully relocked the chest and desk drawers. As he prepared to exit through the window, he heard voices approaching the cabin. "Carson's just over the ridge. Be here within the hour," said a voice Thomas recognized as Holloway's. "Make sure everything's ready, and find that Beaumont man. I want to know exactly what he's told our men." Thomas slipped out the window and quietly latched it behind him. Instead of returning to the front of the cabin, he used the cover of lengthening shadows to make his way toward the stable where Thunder was being kept. The 2 guards remained at their post outside the stable door, alert but unsuspecting. Thomas observed them from behind a stack of hay bales, formulating his next move. With Carson arriving imminently, the time for subtle investigation was ending. He needed to retrieve Thunder and escape with the evidence before Carson arrived, ideally triggering enough chaos to cover their departure. A plan formed in Thomas's mind, audacious but potentially effective. The key would be creating a distraction, significant enough to draw attention away from both Thunder's stable and the canyon's exits. Thomas made his way toward the supply shed he'd observed earlier. If his assessment was correct, it contained not just food provisions, but also blasting powder used for clearing rockfalls in the canyon, standard equipment for remote outlaw camps that needed to maintain their own access routes. The shed was unguarded, the camp's security focused outward against external threats rather than internal sabotage. Thomas slipped inside, finding exactly what he'd expected: several kegs of blasting powder, fuses, and detonation equipment. Working quickly, Thomas prepared 3 small charges, each with extended fuses to allow him time to move between placements. One would go beneath a wagon near the main corral, enough to frighten the horses but not harm them, potentially creating a stampede. The second would target the camp's ammunition storage, visible next to the smithy. The third he kept in reserve. Thomas exited the supply shed. A commotion at the canyon entrance drew everyone's attention. A rider approached at speed, his horse lathered and heaving. "Carson's coming," the man shouted. "Less than 15 minutes out." Holloway emerged from the cabin, barking orders. "Everyone to positions. I want full honors when he arrives." The camp erupted into activity, men rushing to prepare for their leader's arrival, abandoning lesser duties in favor of presentation. The guards at Thunder's stable remained in place, but their attention had shifted toward the canyon entrance. It was now or never. Thomas circled behind the buildings, placing his prepared charges as planned, with the fuses set to ignite in sequence. Over approximately 5 minutes, he positioned himself near Thunder's stable and waited for chaos to begin. The first explosion came right on schedule. The wagon beside the corral erupted in a shower of splinters and flame. As anticipated, the horses in the main corral panicked, breaking through the gate and scattering throughout the canyon. Men rushed toward the corral, attempting to contain the valuable stock. Seconds later, the second charge detonated at the ammunition storage. This explosion was more substantial, sending bullets cooking off in all directions and creating a dangerous crossfire effect. The guards at Thunder's stable hesitated, torn between maintaining their post and responding to the emergency. When a third explosion erupted at the far end of the camp, a fortuitous chain reaction Thomas hadn't planned, their discipline broke. One ran toward the ammunition fire, while the other stepped away from the door, craning to see the extent of the damage. Thomas moved like a striking snake, closing the distance to the remaining guard in 3 long strides. Before the man could react, the butt of Thomas's revolver connected with his temple, dropping him unconscious to the ground. The stable door was locked, but a swift kick splintered the wood around the latch. Thomas pushed inside, finding Thunder, agitated but unharmed, straining against a sturdy rope tied to a center post. "Easy, boy," Thomas murmured, approaching his stallion with calm assurance. "Time to go home." Thunder's ears pricked forward at the familiar voice. The stallion quieted immediately, recognizing his master despite Thomas's disguise. Thomas quickly saddled Thunder, using tack hanging nearby that appeared to be the stallion's own, stolen along with him. As he worked, he could hear shouting and confusion outside as Carson's men struggled to contain the fires and round up escaped horses. Leading Thunder to the stable door, Thomas paused to assess the situation. The camp was in disarray. Attention focused on the multiple emergencies rather than on a single missing horse. The path to the canyon's eastern fork, the least defended of the 3 exits, appeared momentarily clear. Thomas mounted Thunder, the familiar feel of the stallion beneath him, igniting memories of countless pursuits and escapes during his ranger years. He leaned forward, patting the horse's muscular neck. "Just like old times," he whispered. "Let's show them why they should have left us alone." With that, Thomas and Thunder burst from the stable into the chaos of Carson's disintegrating camp, racing toward freedom and the coming confrontation with the man who had orchestrated their separation. Thunder responded to Thomas's touch like the 15 years of partnership had never been interrupted. The stallions surged forward, powerful muscles bunching beneath Thomas as they thundered across the camp toward the Eastern Fork's exit. Several of Carson's men spotted them, shouting in alarm as they recognized the distinctive black stallion making a break for freedom. Two rustlers attempted to block their path, but Thunder, seeming to sense the urgency of their situation, increased his speed, forcing the men to dive aside or be trampled. Bullets whizzed past as more of Carson's men recovered from the initial confusion and opened fire. Thomas kept low over Thunder's neck, making himself as small a target as possible while trusting in the stallion's speed and the camp's continuing chaos to protect them. The entrance to the Eastern Fork loomed. Ahead, a narrow passage between towering canyon walls. Once through, they'd have a fighting chance of escaping. As they approached, Thomas glanced back to see Vance Holloway emerge from his cabin, face contorted with rage as he realized what was happening. "Stop him!" Holloway bellowed, drawing his revolver and firing a wild shot that ricocheted harmlessly off the canyon wall. 5,000 to the man who brings down that horse. The promise of increased reward spurred Carson's men to renewed effort. A rider mounted hastily and spurred his horse in pursuit, cutting an angle to intercept Thomas before he reached the fork's entrance. Thomas recognized the tactical problem immediately. Thunder was faster in a straight race, but the geometry of the canyon meant the pursuer could cut them off before they reached safety. With split-second calculation, Thomas pulled his Colt and fired 2 precise shots, not at the rider, but at the ground directly in front of the pursuing horse. Dust and rock fragments exploded upward, startling the animal and causing it to rear violently. Its rider, unprepared for the sudden movement, tumbled backward off the saddle, creating momentary chaos that blocked the path of other would-be pursuers. Thomas and Thunder shot through the gap and into the Eastern Fork's narrow passage just as Holloway organized a more coordinated response. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, but for the moment they had the advantage of a head start and superior speed. The canyon's Eastern Fork twisted through the rocky landscape like a giant snake with numerous smaller offshoot passages. Thomas had studied Sarah's map thoroughly enough to know that following the main passage would eventually lead them to open country, but also make them easy to track. Instead, he guided Thunder into one of the smaller side canyons, about a half-mile, in a tight passage barely wide enough for horse and rider. Their pursuers, unfamiliar with this route, would likely continue down the main passage, buying precious minutes. The side canyon rose steadily, switchbacking up the rocky slope. Thunder, despite his recent captivity, tackled the challenging terrain. With the sure-footedness that had made him invaluable during Thomas's ranger days, they emerged near the top of the ridge, giving Thomas a commanding view of the area below. In the main canyon, confusion still reigned. Fires burned at multiple points throughout Carson's camp, horses scattered in all directions, and men rushed about ineffectually, trying to restore order. At the canyon's main entrance, a dust cloud announced the arrival of multiple riders, Carson and his additional men arriving to find their carefully prepared trap in shambles. Even from this distance, Thomas could tell which rider was Silas Carson. He rode at the lead of the group, his posture rigid with authority, mounted on a distinctive white stallion, a deliberate counterpoint, perhaps, to Thomas's Black Thunder. Carson reined in sharply at the edge of his camp, clearly stunned by the destruction before him. Holloway rushed to meet his boss, gesturing wildly toward the eastern fork where Thomas had disappeared. "We need to move," Thomas murmured to Thunder, patting the stallion's neck. "Our reunion's been noticed." They continued along the ridgeline, using the higher ground to stay ahead of pursuit while working their way eastward toward redemption. Thomas knew Carson wouldn't abandon the chase, not with his elaborate revenge scheme collapsing and incriminating. Evidence now in Thomas's possession, the immediate challenge was distance. Thunder was strong, but he'd been confined for days and couldn't maintain a hard pace indefinitely. Carson's men would have fresh mounts and intimate knowledge of the territory. Thomas needed to use every advantage his ranger training provided. As dusk deepened into night, Thomas guided Thunder down from the ridge into a shallow streambed that ran roughly eastward. Riding in water would obscure their tracks, making pursuit more difficult in the growing darkness. "Just a little farther, boy," Thomas encouraged as Thunder splashed steadily through the ankle-deep water. "Need to put some distance between us, and them before we rest." Behind them, Thomas spotted flickering points of light spreading out from Three Forks Canyon, lanterns carried by search parties. Carson had organized his men quickly, dispatching them in multiple directions to cut off potential escape routes. Thomas pulled Thunder up short behind a stand of cottonwoods, listening intently. Voices carried on the night air, searchers perhaps a quarter-mile south, moving systematically through the brush. "Can't have gotten far with a winded horse," one voice said. "Carson wants him alive," replied another. "Remember that when you find him, after what he did to our camp. Lucky if he gets breathing." Thomas urged Thunder forward again, angling north to avoid the search party. They rode in silence for another hour, putting precious distance between themselves and Carson's men while conserving Thunder's strength with a measured pace. When they finally stopped in a hidden draw, Thunder was breathing hard but not dangerously winded. Thomas dismounted, quickly checking the stallion for injuries or signs of distress from their escape. Finding none, he loosened the saddle to allow Thunder to cool properly without removing it entirely. They might need to depart in haste. While the stallion drank from a small seep spring, Thomas considered his options. The evidence in his pocket, Marshal Hargrove's badge and Holloway's incriminating letter, needed to reach proper authorities. Carson's influence in the territorial government made Austin suspect, but a federal judge in Dallas would be beyond his reach. The most direct route to Dallas lay east through Redemption, but that path would be heavily watched by Carson's network of informants. The northern route through Apache territory was risky for different reasons, but potentially less monitored. Decisions, Thomas muttered, giving Thunder a handful of oats from his saddlebag, emergency rations he'd packed in case of extended pursuit. A distant gunshot made the decision for him. The sound came from the east, the direction of Redemption, suggesting Carson had already established roadblocks on the main routes back to town. "North it is, then," Thomas told Thunder, tightening the stallion's girth strap and preparing to move out. The long way around. Before mounting, Thomas took stock of his resources. He had both Colts fully loaded, the Winchester with approximately 20 rounds, provisions for 2 days if carefully rationed, and limited water. Not ideal for an extended journey, but sufficient to reach the Whispering Rock trading post 50 miles north, where he could resupply and send word to Porter about his findings. As Thomas prepared to mount, Thunder's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing. The stallion's warning came just in time. Thomas dropped flat as a bullet whizzed through the space where his head had been moments before. "Found him!" shouted a voice from the darkness. "Over here!" Thomas rolled behind a boulder, drawing both Colts in a single fluid motion. A muzzle flash revealed a shooter's position 40 yards away on higher ground. Thomas returned fire, not aiming to hit, but to pin the man down while assessing the situation. 2 more shots came from different positions. He was surrounded by at least 3 men who had somehow tracked him despite his precautions. Carson's men were better than he'd given them credit for. Caldwell, called a familiar voice. That's far enough. Thomas recognized Vance Holloway's distinct tone. Carson's right-hand man had personally joined the pursuit, a testament to how seriously they took his escape. You're surrounded, Caldwell. Holloway continued. No way out except through us. Thomas quickly calculated angles and cover. The draw provided decent protection from direct fire, but also limited his own mobility. Thunder stood exposed, though the darkness provided some concealment. I just want my horse, Holloway, Thomas called back, buying time as he plotted his next move. Let me ride out, and this ends here. Holloway's laugh was humorless. You know that's not how this works. Carson waited 15 years for this moment. He's offering 10,000 now, dead or alive. Quite a price increase, Thomas replied conversationally, using the distraction of dialogue to ease toward Thunder. Must have really upset him. You have no idea, Holloway said. Surrender now. You might live to see morning. Keep fighting. Well, the threat hung in the air, unfinished but clear. Thomas's hand found Thunder's reins in the darkness. The stallion stood perfectly still, trained through years of dangerous situations to remain calm under fire. I appreciate the offer, Thomas called back, but I think I'll take my chances. In one smooth motion, he swung into the saddle and kicked Thunder forward, firing both colts toward the muzzle flashes he'd marked earlier. The sudden movement and covering fire caught Carson's men by surprise, creating a momentary gap in their perimeter. Thunder burst through the opening like a black phantom in the darkness, powerful legs propelling them up the slope and over the ridge before the shooters could adjust their aim. Bullets chased them over the crest, but distance and darkness spoiled the attackers' accuracy. Thomas heard Holloway shouting orders, followed by the sounds of men rushing to their horses. The pursuit continued through the moonlit landscape, a deadly game of hunter, and hunted with Thomas drawing on every skill acquired during 15 years as the territory's most successful manhunter. Each time Carson's men closed the gap, he found a way to confuse the trail or create a false lead that sent them in the wrong direction. By midnight, Thomas had successfully broken contact with his immediate pursuers, though he harbored no illusions about Carson giving up the chase. The man had clearly invested too much in his vengeance to abandon it over a minor setback. As Thunder carried him steadily northward under a canopy of stars, Thomas allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. He had recovered his horse, obtained evidence of Carson's crimes, and escaped the trap set for him. Not a bad day's work for a retired Texas Ranger. The real challenge, however, lay ahead. Carson controlled too much territory and commanded too many men for Thomas to simply outrun him forever. Sooner or later, a final confrontation would be necessary, and when that moment came, Thomas Caldwell intended to be ready. Dawn broke with Thomas, and Thunder concealed in a dense grove of scrub, oak 20 miles northeast of Three Forks Canyon. They had ridden through most of the night, using the darkness to put distance between themselves and Carson's men. Though Thunder showed signs of fatigue, the stallion's remarkable stamina had not failed them. Thomas leaned against a tree trunk, allowing himself a brief rest while keeping watch on their back trail. No immediate signs of pursuit were visible, but he harbored no illusions. Carson would have riders searching every possible route. Removing his hat, Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and took stock of their situation. The evidence in his pocket, Marshal Hargrove's badge and the incriminating letter from Holloway, needed to reach proper authorities quickly before Carson could use his connections to discredit or intercept it. The nearest telegraph office was in Redemption, now likely watched by Carson's men. The northern trading post at Whispering Rock remained his best option. Few more hours' rest, then we'll move on, Thomas told Thunder, who was grazing nearby. On sparse grass, need you at your best for what's coming. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas carefully climbed a nearby rise to survey the surrounding country. The landscape stretched before him, rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and mesquite, giving way to more rugged terrain in the north. Through his field glasses, he spotted several distant dust clouds that could indicate riders, though none appeared to be moving directly toward his position. A movement in the valley below caught his attention, not the dust of riders, but the distinctive shapes of a small band of Comanche hunters moving steadily northward. Thomas watched them with interest. These weren't raiders, but a hunting party of perhaps 5 warriors tracking game. Under normal circumstances, Thomas would have avoided contact. Relations with the Comanche remained tense throughout much of the territory. But these circumstances were far from normal, and an unexpected idea formed in his mind. During his ranger days, Thomas had developed unusual relationships with several Comanche bands. While many rangers had treated all Indians as enemies, Thomas had recognized the complexity of tribal politics and the potential value of selective alliances. His fair dealings had earned him a measure of respect among certain Comanche leaders, particularly Chief Stone Eagle, whose son Thomas had once rescued from white captivity. If this hunting party belonged to Stone Eagle's band, they might provide both assistance and a means of sending word beyond Carson's reach. Decision made, Thomas returned to Thunder and prepared to make contact. He removed the brightly polished star from his chest. A badge would only provoke hostility, and tied a strip of red cloth to his rifle barrel, a signal he had previously used to indicate peaceful intent to Stone Eagle's people. Leading Thunder, Thomas descended into the valley, deliberately making his presence obvious to the hunting party. As expected, the Comanche spotted him quickly. They gathered in a defensive formation, weapons ready but not yet raised, watching, evaluating. Thomas stopped at a respectful distance, raised his rifle with the red cloth clearly visible, then carefully set the weapon on the ground. He remained standing, hands empty at his sides, waiting. After a tense minute, one of the Comanche detached from the group and approached. He was a young warrior, perhaps 25, with features that seemed vaguely familiar to Thomas. The warrior stopped 15 paces away, examining Thomas with wary curiosity. "I seek Stone Eagle," Thomas said in halting Comanche, one of the few phrases he had learned during his ranger days. "I am a friend." The young warrior's expression changed to one of surprise. "You know Stone Eagle?" Thomas nodded. "Many seasons have passed. I am Thomas Caldwell." He used the Comanche name he had been given, "Man who speaks truth." Recognition dawned in the warrior's eyes. The ranger who returned Strongbow to his father. Yes, Thomas confirmed. Strongbow was Stone Eagle's son. The warrior studied him a moment longer, then tapped his chest. "I am Swift Arrow, son of Strongbow. Stone Eagle is my grandfather." Thomas fought to hide his surprise at this stroke of fortune. The young man before him was the grandson of his old ally and the son of the boy he had rescued years ago. If Comanche, tradition held that connection created an obligation that transcended the usual tensions between their peoples. "I am haunted by bad men," Thomas explained, gesturing toward the south. "Men who killed a peace chief of my people. I carry proof that must reach the great chiefs in the east." Swift Arrow considered this information. "Why do you not return to your own people?" "The bad men watch all the trails in my village," Thomas replied. "Too many guns." The young warrior nodded thoughtfully, then turned and spoke rapidly to his companions. After a brief discussion, he returned to Thomas. "You saved my father's life," Swift Arrow stated. "This debt remains unpaid. We will take you to Stone Eagle. He camps 3 rides north near the Great Stones." Thomas knew the location, a distinctive rock formation the whites called Devil's Backbone, that marked the traditional summer hunting grounds of Stone Eagle's band. It was, coincidentally, on the route to Whispering Rock trading post. "I am grateful," Thomas replied, bowing slightly in the Comanche custom. Swift Arrow signaled for Thomas to follow, and the hunting party resumed their northward journey with Thomas and Thunder in their midst. The warriors maintained a careful watch on their new companion, trust built on old debts but tempered by generations of conflict. They traveled efficiently through terrain that would have slowed most white men, using hidden game trails and shallow stream beds that left minimal sign of their passage. Thomas noted their route carefully, impressed by how effectively they avoided open ground that might expose them to distant observers. Around midday, Swift Arrow called a halt in a sheltered ravine. He dispatched 2 of his warriors to backtrack their trail, ensuring they weren't being followed. "Carson's men are skilled trackers," Thomas warned. Swift Arrow's expression hardened. At the name, "Carson is known to the people. His hunters kill more buffalo than they can use. His men attack our camps when warriors are away." He spat on the ground. Bad medicine. This information added a new dimension to Thomas's understanding of Carson's operations. The man wasn't just corrupting white settlements. He was deliberately provoking conflict with the Comanche, perhaps to justify military action that would clear them from lands he coveted. "How many rifles does Carson command?" Thomas asked. "Many," Swift Arrow replied grimly. 30, perhaps 40, more each moon. He studied Thomas with renewed intensity. "You fight against Carson alone?" Thomas nodded. "For now. Other white chiefs may help when they see my proof." The young warrior seemed to reach a decision. He gestured to one of his companions, who produced a small leather pouch from his gear. From it, Swift Arrow withdrew what appeared to be a crudely drawn map. "Carson's hunters use camps here, here, and here," he said, pointing to locations marked with charcoal symbols. "Many guns, many eyes, but they do not know the hidden paths." Thomas examined the map with growing interest. It showed not just Carson's outposts, but also concealed routes through the territory that wouldn't appear on any white man's charts. Knowledge that could prove invaluable in the coming days. "You would share this with me?" Thomas asked, understanding the significance of such trust. Swift Arrow nodded solemnly. "My father says your heart walks the straight path. In dreams, he saw you would return when the people needed you." He tapped the map. "Carson brings war to the people. Perhaps you bring justice." The scouts returned before Thomas could respond, reporting no signs of pursuit. The party resumed their journey northward, now moving with greater urgency as Swift Arrow pushed the pace. By late afternoon, they reached a high ridge overlooking a broad valley. In the distance, Thomas could make out the thin wisps of smoke from multiple campfires. Stone Eagle's band, almost certainly. Swift Arrow pointed to a barely visible trail winding down from their position. "We will reach my grandfather's camp before darkness. There you will find rest and counsel." As they prepared to descend, one of the warriors suddenly stiffened, pointing southward. Thomas followed his gaze, spotting a dust cloud perhaps 3 miles distant, riders moving fast on their trail. "Carson's men," Thomas said grimly. "They've found our track somehow." Swift Arrow's expression remained calm, though his eyes hardened. "They will not find where we go." He issued rapid commands to his companions, who immediately began obscuring their trail while preparing to split up. "You and I will continue to Stone Eagle," he told Thomas. "The others will lead the White Eyes away." He smiled thinly. "Into places they will not enjoy following." Thomas recognized the tactical wisdom of the plan. The hunters would create multiple false trails, leading pursuers into difficult or dangerous terrain, while he and Swift Arrow took a more direct route to safety. "Your men take great risk," Thomas observed. Swift Arrow shrugged. "They are Comanche." No further explanation was necessary. Thomas mounted Thunder, following Swift Arrow down the ridge toward the distant camp and the unexpected alliance that might turn the tide against Silas Carson's ambitions. Behind them, the other warriors melted into the landscape, setting in motion A deadly game of deception and misdirection that would test even the most experienced of Carson's trackers. Twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple as Thomas and Swift Arrow descended into the valley. Stone Eagle's camp spread before them, nearly 30 lodges arranged in the traditional circular pattern, with horses grazing in a natural corral formed by a bend in the creek. Their approach did not go unnoticed. Warriors materialized from the gathering shadows, weapons ready but not yet threatening. Swift Arrow raised his hand in greeting, calling out in Comanche to identify himself and his companion. The sentries permitted them to pass, though their eyes followed Thomas with unconcealed suspicion. A white man in a Comanche camp was an unusual sight, particularly one accompanied by the chief's grandson as an equal rather than a captive. At the center of the camp stood a large lodge decorated with symbols of Stone Eagle's lineage and accomplishments. Swift Arrow dismounted before it, gesturing for Thomas to do the same. "Wait here," he instructed. "I will speak to my grandfather first." Thomas nodded, standing quietly beside Thunder, while curious onlookers gathered at a respectful distance. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, whispering and pointing at the tall white man and his magnificent black horse. After several minutes, Swift Arrow emerged from the lodge and beckoned Thomas forward. "Stone Eagle will see you. Your horse will be tended." Thomas patted Thunder's neck reassuringly before following Swift Arrow into the lodge. The interior was dimly lit by a central fire, the smoke rising to an opening at the peak. Seated on a buffalo robe opposite the entrance was Stone Eagle, his weathered face a map of years and experience. Though at least 70 winters had passed over him, his eyes remained sharp and alert. Beside the chief sat a man in his mid-30s who bore a striking resemblance to Swift Arrow, Strong Bow. Thomas realized the boy he had rescued so many years ago, now grown to manhood. "Man who speaks truth," Stone Eagle greeted him in accented English. "Many seasons have passed since you returned my son to his people." Thomas bowed respectfully. "I am honored that you remember me, Chief Stone Eagle." The old man gestured for Thomas to sit. A Comanche does not forget his debts or his friends. He studied Thomas intently. "My grandson says you are hunted by a bad white chief who kills your peace leaders." "This is true," Thomas confirmed. "His name is Silas Carson. He controls much land to the south and seeks more power. He has murdered a U.S. Marshal and plans to take his place." Stone Eagle nodded slowly. "This Carson, we know him. His hunters trespass on our grounds. His men attack our hunting parties." He exchanged glances with Strong Bow. 3 moons passed. They burned a small camp of our people. Women and children died. Thomas felt a surge of anger at this new revelation of Carson's brutality. "I carry proof of his crimes," he said, withdrawing Marshal Hargrove's badge and Holloway's incriminating letter. "I must get this to the white chiefs in Dallas who can stop him." Stone Eagle examined the items without touching them, then spoke, rapidly in Comanche to Strong Bow. After a brief discussion, the chief turned back to Thomas. "Why do you fight this battle alone? Where are your fellow Long Knives?" The term was an old Comanche name for Texas Rangers, referring to the distinctive Bowie knives many had carried. "I left the Rangers 15 years ago," Thomas explained. "Became a farmer seeking peace. Carson stole my horse." He nodded toward the lodge entrance, indicating Thunder outside, to draw me back into the fight. Understanding flickered in Stone Eagle's eyes. "Ah, he hunts the hunter." The chief considered this. "My grandson says you saved many lives today. Carson's men were close behind you. My warriors led them into Dead Man's Canyon." Thomas recognized the location, a treacherous box canyon notorious for rock slides and ambushes. "Your men took great risk," Stone Eagle shrugged. "Carson would bring war to the people regardless. Better to choose the time and place." He leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. "Now we must decide your path forward." For the next hour, Thomas and the Comanche leaders engaged in careful discussion. Swift Arrow's map was expanded upon, with Stone Eagle identifying additional outposts established by Carson's men throughout the territory. "His web grows larger each moon," the chief explained, using a stick to mark locations in the dirt floor of the lodge. "Here, his men guard the trails to the white settlements. Here, they watch the water crossings. Here," he jabbed the stick. Emphatically, they built a new fortress near where the traders gather. Thomas recognized the location, less than 5 miles from Whispering Rock Trading Post, effectively controlling access to one of the few neutral exchanges between white settlers and various tribes. "How many men at this new place?" Thomas asked. "Perhaps 10 rifles," Strongbow answered, "building strong walls, bringing many supplies." The pattern became clear as more details emerged. Carson wasn't just expanding his criminal empire, he was systematically establishing control over all major trade and transportation routes in the region. Once officially appointed as U.S. Marshal, he would have both the authority and the infrastructure to dominate the entire territory. "I must reach Dallas," Thomas said, thinking aloud. "The federal judge there stands beyond Carson's influence." Stone Eagle exchanged glances with his son and grandson before speaking. "The white man's trail to Dallas is long and watched by Carson's eyes, but there is another way." He traced a route in the dirt, a winding path through lands rarely traveled by white men, passing through territories controlled by Comanche and their occasional allies among the Kiowa. "This path leads to the Iron Road," Stone Eagle explained, referring to the railroad that had reached North Texas in recent years. 4 days hard ride. From there the fire wagon can carry you to the white chiefs in Dallas. Thomas studied the proposed route. It would take him through some of the most dangerous countries in the territory, not because of the tribes, who would likely grant him passage out of respect for Stone Eagle, but because of the harsh terrain itself. Yet it offered the best chance of evading Carson's network of informants and hired guns. "I would be grateful for your guidance," Thomas said. Stone Eagle nodded. "Strongbow will lead you to the Iron Road. He knows the white man's ways and the hidden paths." He fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare. "But first, you must rest. Tomorrow will bring its own battles." As their council concluded, Thomas was shown to a small lodge prepared for him. Thunder had been unsaddled and was grazing contentedly under the watchful eye of a young Comanche, boy who clearly admired the magnificent stallion. Despite his exhaustion, Thomas found sleep elusive. The day's revelations weighed heavily on his mind. Carson's influence extended further than he had imagined, and the man's willingness to provoke conflicts with the Comanche revealed a ruthlessness that exceeded even Thomas's initial assessment. Shortly before dawn, Thomas was awakened by Swift Arrow. The young warrior's expression was grave. "Riders approach from the south," he reported. "Many rifles. Carson's men have found our trail." Thomas rose immediately, strapping on his gun belt. "How many?" 20, perhaps more, led by a man on a white horse, Silas Carson himself. Thomas felt a cold certainty settle over him. "How long?" "They will reach the valley by midday," Swift Arrow replied, "unless they are delayed." Outside, the camp was already in motion, women packing essential belongings, warriors preparing weapons. Stone Eagle stood in the center, issuing calm but firm instructions. "We cannot fight 20 rifles," Thomas said as he joined the chief. "I should leave now, draw them away from your people." Stone Eagle shook his head. "This is not your decision alone. Carson threatens my people whether you are here or not." The old chief's eyes gleamed with determination. "Besides, Comanche do not abandon guests." Strongbow approached, leading Thomas's saddled horse. "The women and children are moving to the hidden canyon," he reported. "Warriors, prepare." Stone Eagle nodded approval, then turned to Thomas. "We will not seek battle with Carson's men, but neither will we flee like frightened deer. My son will guide you north once we know Carson's strength. Thomas recognized the wisdom in this approach. A direct confrontation would risk unnecessary casualties on both sides. Yet by neither fleeing nor fighting immediately, Stone Eagle was maintaining both honor and tactical advantage. Throughout the morning, Comanche scouts reported on Carson's approaching force. 23 riders, well armed and moving with purpose. Despite the difficult terrain, Carson rode at their head on his white stallion, with Vance Holloway and another man Thomas didn't recognize serving as his lieutenants. By mid-morning, most of the camp had been relocated, leaving only warriors concealed among the rocky outcroppings overlooking the valley. Thomas, Strongbow, and Swift Arrow watched from a hidden position as Carson's men entered the abandoned camp. Even from a distance, Thomas could read Carson's fury as he discovered the Comanche had anticipated his arrival. The outlaw leader dispatched riders in several directions, attempting to pick up the trail of the departed tribe. He is persistent, Strongbow observed. Desperate, Thomas corrected. The evidence I carry would destroy everything he's built. They watched as Carson established a perimeter around the abandoned camp, methodically searching each lodge for clues. His actions revealed a man accustomed to command and determined to complete his mission regardless of obstacles. We should move now, Strongbow advised. While his men are scattered, we can reach Beartooth Pass by nightfall, then follow the hidden trail to the Iron Road. Thomas nodded agreement, though his eyes remained fixed on the distant figure of Silas Carson. Part of him, the ranger he had once been, wanted to confront the man directly, to end this chase once and for all. Reading his thoughts, Swift Arrow spoke quietly. That battle will come, but not today. Today, we ensure the proof reaches those who can bring justice. Thomas acknowledged the wisdom in these words. Personal vengeance, however justified, had to remain secondary to the larger goal of exposing Carson's crimes and ending his reign of terror over the territory. With a final glance at his enemy, Thomas turned Thunder northward, following Strongbow into the rugged landscape beyond the valley. Behind them, Stone Eagle's warriors prepared to lead Carson's men on a long, frustrating chase through territory where white trackers would find themselves at a distinct disadvantage. The next phase of Thomas's journey had begun, a race to reach civilization with the evidence that would bring down Silas Carson's empire of corruption. Beartooth Pass lived up to its name. Jagged rock formations resembling massive fangs jutted skyward on either side of the narrow trail. Thomas, Strongbow, and Swift Arrow navigated this treacherous terrain as afternoon shadows lengthened across the landscape. The path was barely wide enough for their horses, with sheer drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet to the canyon floor. Below, few white men know this trail, Strongbow explained as they carefully picked their way forward. Our people have used it for generations to move between hunting grounds unseen. Thomas nodded, giving Thunder his head to choose the safest footing. The stallion moved with confidence despite the difficult terrain, confirming Thomas's faith in the horse's instincts. How far is the next water? Thomas asked, noting their depleted canteens. Half-day's ride, Swift Arrow replied. Hidden spring in Stone Basket Canyon. As they reached a wider section of the trail, Strongbow signaled a halt. He dismounted and moved to a vantage point overlooking their back trail, studying the distant landscape through narrowed eyes. Dust, he finally announced. Many riders following our path to the pass. Thomas joined him, borrowing Swift Arrow's spyglass to confirm the observation. In the distance, at least a dozen riders approached the base of the pass, Carson's men having somehow tracked them despite the Comanche warriors' diversionary tactics. Carson is determined, Thomas observed, returning the spyglass. Or desperate. Both, Strongbow replied grimly. This pass is dangerous in darkness. They will either camp at the base until morning or risk death to pursue us now. What would Carson do? Swift Arrow asked Thomas. Thomas considered the question, thinking back to what he knew of the man. He wouldn't risk his entire force in a night crossing, but he might send his best riders, Holloway and a few others, to maintain contact while the main group follows at first light. Strongbow nodded in agreement. Then we continue through the night, gain distance while they wait. It was a sound strategy, but demanding on both horses and riders. The trail ahead would be treacherous enough in daylight. Negotiating it in darkness would require every ounce of skill and concentration they possessed. As Thomas remounted Thunder, a distant crack echoed through the canyon. A rifle shot, followed by several more in quick succession. Swift Arrow smiled, thinly. Stone Eagle's warriors, they harass Carson's men, making them nervous in unfamiliar territory. "Will they attack directly?" Thomas asked, concerned about potential casualties. Strongbow shook his head. "No, they will shoot from distance. Vanish like smoke, reappear elsewhere. Carson will waste many bullets on shadows. This guerrilla strategy would slow the pursuit without directly engaging Carson's superior numbers and firepower, a classic Comanche tactic that had frustrated military campaigns for decades. They continued through the pass as daylight faded, their pace necessarily slow due to the dangerous terrain. When darkness fell completely, Strongbow produced several small pouches from his saddlebag. "Foxfire," he explained, sprinkling the contents. A phosphorescent fungus along the edges of the trail ahead. The subtle glow was just enough to mark the path without creating a beacon visible from a distance. Throughout the night, they continued their careful journey, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and check their back trail. Occasionally, they glimpsed distant points of light, campfires at the base of the pass where the main body of Carson's men had indeed halted for the night. Near midnight, Swift Arrow's keen hearing detected sounds of pursuit, horses negotiating the difficult trail, perhaps an hour behind them. "Holloway," Thomas guessed, "and probably 2 or 3 of their best trackers." "They are persistent," Strongbow acknowledged. "But we have advantage in darkness. This is our territory." He led them onto a side trail so narrow and overgrown it was nearly invisible even in daylight. The path wound down a steep slope before connecting with a dry stream bed that offered faster travel. By dawn, they had put significant distance between themselves and their pursuers. The landscape had changed from sharp rocky terrain to rolling hills covered with scrub oak and mesquite. They took shelter in a hidden ravine to rest and water the horses at a small seep spring. While Swift Arrow kept watch, Thomas and Strongbow discussed the day ahead. "Stone Basket Canyon is 4 hours' ride north," Strongbow explained, sketching a map in the dirt. "Good water, difficult approach. We can rest there before continuing to Coal Creek Station." "What's at Coal Creek?" Thomas asked. "Small trading. Post. One white man married a Kiowa woman, friend to the people." Strongbow's expression became more serious. "From there, 2 days to the Iron Road, but Carson has men watching the rails." This confirmed what Thomas had suspected. Carson's operation extended even to the railroads, allowing him to monitor movement throughout the territory. "We'll need a plan to get through their surveillance," Thomas noted, thinking aloud. Swift Arrow returned from his watch position. "Riders coming, still distant but moving fast," Thomas grimaced. Holloway was proving as tenacious as his employer. "How did they track us through that side trail?" Strongbow's expression darkened. "They have Lipan tracker with them. I saw sign yesterday, but hoped I was mistaken." The Lipan Apache were legendary for their tracking abilities, sometimes able to follow trails days old across terrain that would baffle even experienced frontiersmen. If Holloway had indeed recruited such a tracker, their path to the railroad had just become significantly more challenging. "We need to split up," Thomas decided. "I'll create a false trail east, then circle back north. You two continue directly to Stone Basket Canyon." Strongbow shook his head firmly. My father ordered me to guide you to the Iron Road. A Comanche does not abandon this duty. Your father ordered you to ensure the evidence reaches Dallas, Thomas countered. That happens best if we divide Carson's forces. After a brief but intense discussion, they agreed on a compromise. Thomas and Strong Bow would separate temporarily, creating two distinct trails to confuse their pursuers, then reunite at Stone Basket Canyon by midday. Swift Arrow would remain behind to observe which trail Holloway chose to follow, then catch up with them later. Before departing, Strong Bow gave Thomas detailed directions and several identifying markers to find the hidden entrance to Stone Basket Canyon. The canyon mouth looks like solid rock from most angles, he explained. Look for 3 balanced stones that form a triangle. The path lies directly behind them. Thomas committed these instructions to memory, knowing that finding the concealed entrance could mean the difference between success and capture. With their plan established, Thomas urged Thunder eastward across open country where their trail would be clearly visible, deliberately leaving signs that would attract attention. After 3 miles, he would angle northward through a series of rocky outcroppings that would allow him to obscure his trail before turning back toward the rendezvous point. The maneuver required precise timing and flawless execution. Thomas pushed Thunder hard across the open ground, knowing they were making themselves visible to any watchers on the distant ridgelines. When they reached the rocky terrain, he immediately slowed their pace, carefully picking a route that would minimize signs. For the next 2 hours, Thomas employed every tracking countermeasure he had learned during his years as a ranger. Doubling back, riding through shallow water, using rocky ground that held no hoofprints. Thunder, sensing the need for stealth, moved with deliberate care, placing his hooves exactly where Thomas directed. By mid-morning, Thomas approached the coordinates Strong Bow had described for Stone Basket Canyon. The landscape appeared to be a continuous rock wall with no obvious opening or path. For several tense minutes, he searched for the marker formation, 3 balanced stones in a triangle pattern. When he finally spotted it, Thomas nearly missed its significance. The formation looked entirely natural. 3 weather-worn boulders that happened to rest against each other. Only when viewed from precisely the right angle did they form a perfect triangle. As promised, behind this marker lay a narrow fissure in the seemingly solid rock face, barely wide enough for a horse and rider to pass through single file. Thomas guided Thunder into this opening, which immediately twisted to the left, then right, before suddenly opening into a breathtaking canyon. Stone Basket Canyon was aptly named. The interior resembled an enormous basket, with high walls surrounding a flat bottom, perhaps half a mile across. A small, clear spring bubbled up near the center, creating a pool surrounded by lush vegetation, an oasis hidden within the harsh landscape. Strongbow had already arrived and established a small camp near the spring. He nodded in approval at Thomas's timely arrival. "Good, you found the way without difficulty." "Nearly missed it," Thomas admitted, dismounting to allow Thunder to drink. "Holloway's tracker would have ridden right past it. If Swift Arrow's plan succeeded, they followed your trail east," Strongbow observed. "It will cost them many hours before they realize their mistake." Thomas surveyed the canyon, noting its defensive advantages. The single entrance could be easily monitored, and the high walls would prevent anyone from observing them from outside. It was an ideal location to rest and prepare for the journey ahead. As Thunder drank deeply from the spring, Thomas studied their position on Swift Arrow's map. They had covered impressive ground since leaving Stone Eagle's camp, but the most challenging portion of their journey still lay ahead. Between them and the railroad stood Carson's outpost near Whispering Rock Trading Post, a fortified position they would somehow need to circumvent or penetrate. "Tonight we rest," Strongbow declared. "Tomorrow we face Carson's fortress." 2 weeks later, Thomas Caldwell stood on the platform of the Dallas Federal Courthouse, watching as marshals escorted a shackled Silas Carson up the steps. The once powerful Outlaw's face was a mask of cold fury as he caught sight of Thomas, but he said nothing as he was led inside to face the judge. The journey from Stonebasket Canyon to this moment had tested Thomas to his limits. The final confrontation at Carson's fortress near Whispering Rock trading post still played vividly in his mind, a desperate gamble that could have ended very differently. That night had begun with Thomas and Strongbow observing Carson's outpost from a concealed position on the ridge above. Swift Arrow had rejoined them with news that Holloway and his trackers had indeed followed Thomas's false trail east before realizing their mistake. The delay had bought them precious time, but Holloway was now doubling back, perhaps 12 hours. Behind them, 10 men inside the walls, Swift Arrow reported, counting the guards visible on the wooden palisade surrounding the fortified trading post. More in the buildings, all well armed. What had once been a simple trading post had been transformed into a military-style fort, controlling the only reliable route to the railroad station 20 miles north. Carson had planned well. Anyone traveling to or from the civilized East would pass through his checkpoint. "We need a diversion," Thomas had said, studying the fortress layout through his field glasses. "Something big enough to draw most of them out." Strongbow nodded thoughtfully. "The horse herd," he suggested, pointing to a corral containing at least 30 horses on the outpost's western edge. "Carson's men value their mounts. A night stampede would draw many rifles away from the walls." It was a solid plan, but still left them facing a fortified position with unknown numbers inside. As they continued their surveillance, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A supply wagon approaching from the south, heavily loaded and guarded by just 2 riders. "Carson's supplies," Swift Arrow observed. "They come each week from the south camps." Thomas's mind raced with sudden inspiration. If we could take control of that wagon. The plan came together quickly. Swift Arrow would create the horse stampede as a diversion, while Thomas and Strongbow intercepted the supply wagon before it reached the fortress. With control of the wagon, they would attempt the boldest strategy of all, driving directly through the front gate under the guise of a legitimate delivery. The execution had been nearly flawless. Swift Arrow's noisemakers and flaming arrows sent the horse herd into panicked flight, drawing most of the outpost's defenders in frantic pursuit. Meanwhile, Thomas and Strongbow overwhelmed the surprised wagon guards with minimal violence, securing their cooperation with a combination of threats and promises. Dressed in one of the guards' dusters and hat, Thomas had driven the wagon directly to the fortress gate while Strongbow lay hidden among the supplies, Thunder tethered and concealed behind. The remaining guards, distracted by the distant chaos of the stampede, had opened the gate with only cursory inspection. Once inside, they moved with swift precision. Thomas located the telegraph office, subduing the startled operator before he could sound an alarm. With the telegraph secured, Strongbow freed Thunder and created a secondary diversion by setting fire to a storage shed filled with ammunition. The resulting explosions and confusion allowed Thomas to send a critical telegram to Judge Henry Parker in Dallas, detailing Carson's crimes and his imminent arrival with evidence. More importantly, it prevented Carson from using the telegraph to alert his allies about Thomas's escape. Their escape from the fortress amid gunfire and chaos had been narrow. Thunder's speed and Strongbow's knowledge of the terrain barely kept them ahead of pursuit. At the railroad depot 20 miles north, they had separated. Strongbow returning to his people while Thomas continued eastward by train, the evidence secure in his saddlebags. Now, 2 weeks later, justice was being served. Judge Parker, incorruptible and legendary for his fairness, had moved swiftly once Thomas presented Marshal Hargrove's badge and the incriminating documents. Federal marshals had been dispatched throughout the territory, arresting Carson's allies and dismantling his criminal network. "Mr. Caldwell," a voice pulled Thomas from his memories. He turned to find Sheriff Porter mounting the courthouse steps. "Sheriff," Thomas greeted him with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you in Dallas?" Porter smiled grimly. "Wouldn't miss Carson's day of reckoning. Besides, brought some additional witnesses from Redemption." He gestured toward Sarah Harlan and her father, who waited nearby. Sarah approached, her face brightening as she saw Thomas. "You made it," she said simply, relief evident in her voice. "As promised," Thomas replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Respectfully, your map proved invaluable." Inside the courthouse, the proceedings moved with surprising speed. Judge Parker, a towering figure with a shock of white hair and penetrating eyes, had already reviewed the evidence thoroughly. Carson's attorneys attempted various delaying tactics, but the judge brushed them aside with evident irritation. When Thomas took the stand to testify, he recounted the events methodically, his voice steady as he described finding Marshal Hargrove's badge and personal effects in Holloway's possession. The letter detailing the murder, written in Holloway's own hand, was entered into evidence to devastating effect. Carson maintained his cold composure throughout most of the testimony, but his mask slipped when Thomas described the attacks on Comanche camps, including the killing of women and children. For a brief moment, naked hatred flashed in the outlaw's eyes, confirming his guilt more clearly than any document could. "So it was personal," Thomas concluded his testimony, meeting Carson's gaze directly. "He stole my horse to draw me out, hoping to eliminate the one man who could connect him to his brother's deaths 15 years ago." "And did you kill his brother, Marshal Caldwell?" Judge Parker asked. Thomas didn't flinch from the question. "I did, Your Honor. They died resisting arrest during a bank robbery in El Paso. They chose bullets over surrender." Carson half rose from his seat before his attorneys restrained him. Judge Parker gavelled for order, his expression stern. "Mr. Carson will control himself or be removed from my courtroom," he warned. The verdict, when it came after 3 days of testimony, surprised no one. Silas Carson was found guilty of multiple counts of murder, including the killing of a federal officer. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. As the courtroom emptied, Thomas found himself face to face with Carson one final time, as marshals prepared to return the condemned man to his cell. "You should have left it alone, Caldwell," Carson said, his voice low and controlled despite his circumstances. "I would have made a better marshal than Hargrove ever was." Thomas studied the man who had caused so much suffering simply to satisfy his ambition and thirst for revenge. "A badge doesn't make the man, Carson. Your brothers learned that the hard way." Something like respect flickered briefly in Carson's eyes. "We'll never know now." He glanced down at Thomas's hip, where one of his prized Colts hung in its holster. "Should have just shot me when you had the chance." "That would have made me no better than you," Thomas replied evenly. Carson laughed without humor as the marshals led him away. "Keep telling yourself that, Ranger." Outside the courthouse, Sarah Harlan waited beside Thunder, who stood saddled and ready for travel. The stallion nickered softly as Thomas approached, nosing his pockets for the peppermint candy he often carried. "You're leaving?" Sarah asked, noting his travel preparations. Thomas nodded. "Time to head home. The farm won't tend to itself." "Will you go back to being just a farmer?" There was a note of something like disappointment in her voice. Thomas considered the question carefully. The past weeks had awakened the ranger in him, reactivating skills and instincts he had thought long buried. He'd remembered what it meant to stand against injustice, to make a difference in a territory still struggling to find its balance between lawlessness and civilization. Not exactly he finally answered, reaching into his vest pocket and withdrawing. A telegram that had arrived that morning. The governor's office sent this. They're reorganizing the Rangers after Carson's corruption came to light. Asked if I'd consider training new recruits. Sarah's eyes widened. And will you? Told them I'd do it part-time, Thomas replied. 3 days a week in Austin. Rest of the time I'll still be growing corn and raising horses at Oakwood. Sounds like you get to keep both lives, she observed with a small smile. Trying to, anyway. Thomas adjusted Thunder's saddle straps, checking them with practiced hands. Thought I had to choose between being a ranger and having peace. Maybe there's a middle path. As they spoke, Sheriff Porter approached, accompanied by Ethan Miller, Thomas's neighbor, who had first warned him about the riders asking questions. Heading back to Redemption? Porter asked. Could use the company on the trail. Thomas nodded. Be good to have companions. He turned to Sarah. Will you be traveling back with your father? Actually, she replied with a hint of color in her cheeks. I was hoping to discuss a business proposition with you. Father's expanding the store, and we've been considering opening a second location near Oakwood. Might need local advice on the venture. Thomas couldn't help but smile. I'm sure we could arrange a consultation. As the small group prepared to depart Dallas, Thomas took one last look at the courthouse where Carson awaited his fate. The outlaw had stolen his horse thinking it would lead to Thomas's destruction, never understanding that some things run deeper than revenge. Thunder nudged Thomas's shoulder impatiently, eager to begin the journey home. The stallion had come through their adventure remarkably well, seeming almost to have enjoyed the return to action after years of relative quiet on the farm. Just like his master, Porter observed, noting the stallion's eager demeanor. Thomas mounted, settling into the familiar saddle. Let's go home, boy, he told Thunder, patting the horse's muscular neck. Still got crops to tend, as they rode. Away from Dallas, Thomas reflected on how a simple theft had changed the course of so many lives. Carson had sought revenge, but found justice instead. Thomas had sought only the return of his horse, but rediscovered a part of himself he had thought forever abandoned. The badge in his saddlebag, a new commission as a training officer for the restructured Rangers, represented not a return to his old life, but the beginning of something different. A balance between the peace he'd found as a farmer and the purpose he'd known as a lawman. Thunder's powerful stride carried him forward, just as it had through the darkest moments of their adventure. The stallion had been worth fighting for, not just for his value or the years of partnership they shared, but for what he represented, the principle that some things, once taken, must be reclaimed regardless of cost. As Oakwood Ranch appeared on the horizon 5 days later, Thomas felt a sense of completion. The journey had come full circle. His prized horse was home. The corruption that had threatened the territory was being dismantled, and Thomas Caldwell had found a new path forward that honored both his past and his future. What the Rustlers never understood when they stole that magnificent black stallion was that they weren't just taking a horse. They were awakening a legend that had merely been sleeping, not dead. And legends, once awakened, have a way of changing the world around them. Thomas dismounted at his farmhouse door, home at last. Welcome back, boy, he told Thunder, removing the saddle from the stallion's back. Reckon we both learned something on this little adventure. Thunder nickered softly in response, nudging Thomas's pocket for a treat before trotting happily toward the familiar pasture where he belonged. Some horses were worth stealing, but this particular horse, had proven far more costly than any rustler could have imagined. For in stealing Thomas Caldwell's prized stallion, they had reawakened the most feared Texas Ranger in the territory's history and set in motion their own downfall. As Thomas watched Thunder grazing peacefully, in the evening light he smiled. Sometimes justice wore a farmer's clothes, but carried a ranger's determination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.